Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Sleepy Scares. I know many of you tune in to unwind and drift off into a peaceful sleep, so before you settle in, I'd love for you to drop a comment, letting me know where in the world you're listening from. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get cozy, relax, and dive right in. Story 1. The rain began falling just as I stepped off the train, the cold, unrelenting downpour that soaked me to the bone in minutes. The station was deserted, the only sound the rhythmic tapping of rain against the iron roof. I clutched the crumpled letter in my pocket, its cryptic instructions leading me to this forgotten corner of the countryside. The letter had no return address, only a single signature at the bottom. It spoke of an inheritance, a long-abandoned family property, and a warning not to linger past nightfall. The path leading away from the station was overgrown, the cobblestones slick with moss. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on me as I trudged forward, guided by the faint light of a lantern swinging from my hand. Every sound in the woods seemed amplified. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant cry of an animal I couldn't identify. It wasn't long before the path widened, revealing a gate tangled in vines. Beyond it stood a house, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. The house was enormous, a crumbling relic of another era. Its windows were dark, its walls streaked with decay, and yet it seemed to watch me as I approached. The gate creaked open with a groan, and I stepped onto the grounds. The air was heavy, suffused with a strange stillness that made my skin crawl. As I reached the front steps, I hesitated. The letter had said the house was mine, but it felt wrong, like trespassing in a place long forgotten by the living. The key fit the lock perfectly, and the door swung open with a reluctant sigh. Inside, the air was colder than outside, thick with the scent of damp wood and mildew. My footsteps echoed on the wooden floor as I explored. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung like curtains in the corners. Yet there were signs of recent activity. A candle burned low on the mantel, a chair pulled out as if someone had just been sitting there. I felt the prickle of eyes on the back of my neck and spun around, but there was nothing. The wind howled through broken panes, carrying with it a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I found the staircase and began my ascent. Each step groaned under my weight, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. At the top, a long hallway stretched out before me, its floor littered with debris. The doors were closed, their paint peeling like dead skin. I opened the first door and stepped into a bedroom frozen in time. A four-poster bed sat against the wall, its canopy tattered and stained. The mirror hung crookedly on the opposite wall, its glass cloudy and warped. As I approached, my reflection wavered, distorted by the imperfections in the glass, but then it moved. My reflection turned its head while I remained still. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The room grew colder, and I heard a faint whisper, like someone speaking just out of earshot. I fled the room, slamming the door behind me, and leaned against it, gasping for air. The whispers didn't stop. They followed me down the hallway, growing louder, more insistent. They weren't words, not exactly, but a jumble of sounds that scraped against my sanity. I threw open another door and found a library. Shelves lined the walls, their books warped and crumbling with age. In the center of the room was a desk, and on it sat an open book, its pages blank except for a single word scrawled in the center. Leave. The word seemed to writhe on the page, twisting and curling like smoke. I slammed the book shut, and the whispers stopped. For a moment, there was silence, and I dared to hope that whatever haunted this place had relented. But then the house began to groan, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from its very foundation. The walls trembled, the floorboards buckled, and I ran. I didn't care where I was going, only that I needed to get out. I barreled down the stairs, my lantern swinging wildly, casting shadows that danced like demons on the walls. As I reached the front door, it slammed shut in my face. I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The groaning grew louder, joined now by a chorus of whispers, laughter, and cries. I turned to face the house, and it was alive. The walls pulsed like a beating heart. The shadows swirled together into forms that lunged at me, their faces twisted with malice. I screamed and backed away, searching for another way out. A window shattered, and I ran toward it, leaping through the jagged opening. Glass tore at my skin. But I didn't care. I hit the ground hard and rolled to my feet, sprinting toward the gate. The whispers followed me, rising to a deafening crescendo as I reached the road. I didn't stop running until I reached the station, collapsing onto the platform as the train pulled in. The conductor looked at me with concern, but I couldn't explain. I boarded without a word, and as the train pulled away, I looked back. The house stood in the distance, its windows now glowing with an eerie light. It had let me go, but I knew I hadn't escaped. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it was waiting. Story 2. The forest stretched endlessly around me, a tangled mess of ancient trees and suffocating darkness. I'd only planned to be there until sunset, just long enough to snap a few photos for the article I was writing about local legends. They called it Blackthorn Grove, a name whispered with unease by the townsfolk. Tales of disappearances, strange lights, and an overwhelming sense of dread surrounded the place. I thought it was just another spooky story to keep kids from wandering too far from home. I wasn't afraid. I should have been. The path had been clear when I entered, a narrow trail lined with mossy stones and overhanging branches. But as the hours passed, the trees seemed to close in, their gnarled roots twisting up from the earth as if trying to ensnare me. The sun dipped below the horizon faster than I anticipated, plunging the forest into an oppressive darkness. My flashlight barely cut through the shadows, its beam weak and flickering as if the batteries were draining faster than they should. I tried to retrace my steps, but the trail was gone. There was no path, no moss-covered stones, just endless trees in every direction. Panic bubbled up in my chest, but I forced it down. I needed to think. I needed to think. I needed to stay calm. That's when I heard it. A soft rustling, just beyond the edge of the light. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was too rhythmic to be the wind, too deliberate. I called out, my voice trembling. Hello? Is someone there? Silence. Then a low, guttural sound, like a growl mixed with the creak of ancient wood. I backed away, my heart pounding in my ears. The rustling grew louder, closer, surrounding me on all sides. Shapes began to emerge from the darkness, twisted figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that reflected the weak beam of my flashlight. They didn't move like people. They jerked and shuddered, their heads tilting unnaturally as they crept closer. I ran. I didn't care where, as long as it rose away from me. Branches clawed at my face and arms. Roots threatened to trip me with every step. But I didn't stop. The growling followed me, a chorus of deep, inhuman sounds that seemed to come from the trees themselves. I stumbled into a clearing and collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. The clearing was wrong. The ground was bare, devoid of grass or plants, and the air was heavy, pressing against my skin like a physical weight. In the center stood a tree unlike any I'd ever seen. Its bark was black and slick, glistening as if it were coated in oil. Its branches twisted upward, reaching for the sky like skeletal hands, and from those branches hung dozens of objects, Small, human-shaped figures made of twigs and bound with strips of fabric. They swayed gently despite the stillness of the air. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. The only light came from the tree itself, a faint, pulsing glow that seemed to emanate from within. I felt something behind me, a presence so heavy it made my knees buckle. I didn't dare turn around. The air grew colder, and I could hear breathing, slow, deliberate, right next to my ear. A voice, low and rasping, whispered words I couldn't understand. My body refused to move, frozen in place as the tree's glow intensified. Shadows danced around me, and the figures hanging from the branches began to twitch, their twig limbs jerking as if trying to break free. The voice grew louder, its tone commanding, insistent. I didn't understand the words, but I felt their meaning deep in my bones. You shouldn't have come here. The ground beneath me began to shift, roots writhing like snakes as they coiled around my ankles. I struggled, but they held me fast, pulling me closer to the tree. The figures on the branches snapped free one by one, landing on the ground and crawling toward me with unnatural speed. Their hollow eyes burned with a faint red light, and their twig mouths opened in soundless screams. The voice reached a deafening roar, the air vibrating with its power. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the tree splitting open, revealing an abyss that seemed to stretch forever. When I woke, I was lying at the edge of the forest, the morning sun warming my skin. My clothes were torn, my arms and legs covered in cuts and bruises, but I was alive. My camera was gone, as was my flashlight, and the letter I'd found tucked into my pocket bore a single word: leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I never went back to Blackthorn Grove, but I can still feel it watching me, its twisted branches reaching for me in the corners of my dreams. Story 3. The old highway stretched endlessly before me, a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through a vast and desolate landscape. I was driving home after a long business trip, the kind of journey where exhaustion blurred the lines between reality and imagination. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the world bathed in darkness, save for the faint glow of my headlights illuminating the road ahead. The radio, once a comforting companion, had succumbed to static, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement. I was somewhere between nowhere and somewhere, the kind of in-between place where the map might as well be blank. The occasional road sign flickered into view, its letters weathered and illegible, offering no reassurance of direction. The loneliness of the road began to weigh on me, a palpable presence that pressed against my chest. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just fatigue, but the unease lingered, growing stronger with every mile. It was then that I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the road, illuminated briefly by my headlights. It was a woman, her long hair disheveled, and her dress torn, waving frantically as I approached. My heart skipped a beat. An instinct took over. I slowed the car, rolling down the window as I pulled to a stop beside her. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I need help. They're coming." "Who's coming?" I asked, glancing around the empty road and the shadowy landscape beyond. There was no one else in sight, just the endless darkness stretching in every direction. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Please, just drive." Against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door. She climbed in quickly, slamming the door shut behind her and locking it with trembling fingers. Her hands were scratched and dirty, her nails chipped as if she'd been clawing at something. As I pulled back onto the road, I glanced at her, trying to make sense of the situation. "What's going on? Are you hurt?" She didn't answer right away, her gaze fixed on the rearview mirror, as if expecting something to materialize out of the darkness. Finally, she whispered, "They won't stop until they find me." A chill ran down my spine at her words, but before I could press her further, the car lurched violently to the side. I fought to keep control as the tires screeched against the asphalt. When the car stabilized, I saw them, shadowy figures emerging from the darkness, their movements erratic and unnatural. My heart pounded as I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, the engine roaring in protest as we sped away. The figures gave chase, their forms flickering like broken images, sometimes appearing closer than they should have been. The woman beside me clutched her knees to her chest, rocking slightly as if in a trance. "Don't let them catch us," she muttered over and over, her voice monotone and detached. The road ahead seemed to stretch infinitely, the darkness growing thicker, swallowing the edges of the highway until it felt like we were driving through a tunnel with no exit. The figures didn't tire, their relentless pursuit filling me with a terror I couldn't comprehend. I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Who are they?" I finally shouted, my voice breaking under the strain. She looked at me then, her eyes hollow and filled with despair. "They're the ones who take you when you've been forgotten," she said. "When the world moves on and leaves you behind, they come for you." I escaped, but they won't stop until I'm theirs again. Her words made no sense, but the fear in her voice was undeniable. I wanted to question her further, to demand an explanation, but the car's headlights flickered, and my focus snapped back to the road. A massive shadow loomed ahead, a figure taller and broader than the others. Its form was undefined, a shifting mass of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. I swerved to avoid it, the car skidding dangerously close to the edge of the road. The woman screamed, a raw, piercing sound that cut through the chaos. The shadow reached out, its limb a long, tendril-like extension, scraping against the side of the car with a screech that set my teeth on edge. We were going too fast, the car's engine whining in protest. But slowing down wasn't an option. I could feel the presence of the figures pressing closer, their unnatural movements a blur in the rearview mirror. The woman beside me was sobbing now, her words incoherent as she clung to the door handle. The road began to change, the asphalt cracking and buckling as if the ground itself was rejecting our escape. Potholes appeared out of nowhere, and the car jolted violently as I struggled to navigate the treacherous terrain. The figures were closer now, their forms more defined. They had faces, or what should have been faces, but their features were wrong, blurred and shifting, as if they were trying to remember what they once looked like. The woman reached out suddenly, grabbing my arm. "There's a turn up ahead," she said, her voice urgent. "You have to take it. It's the only way." I didn't understand how she could know that, but the desperation in her voice left me no choice. I saw the turn she spoke of, a narrow dirt path barely visible in the gloom, and veered onto it without hesitation. The car bounced wildly on the uneven ground, the tires struggling to find traction. The figures hesitated at the edge of the road, as if the path was something they couldn't cross. For a moment, I thought we'd escaped, but the relief was short-lived. The shadows began to seep into the trees on either side of us, their forms blending with the darkness as they flanked us from every angle. The path twisted and turned, the dense forest closing in around us. Branches scraped against the car like claws, and the headlights barely illuminated more than a few feet ahead. The woman was chanting something under her breath, her hands pressed together as if in prayer. The air grew colder, each breath visible as a puff of white mist. The path ended abruptly, opening into a clearing dominated by a massive tree. Its trunk was gnarled and blackened, its branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. At its base was a door, an old, weathered thing that seemed impossibly out of place. The woman unbuckled her seatbelt and turned to me, her expression a mixture of terror and determination. "This is it," she said. "I have to go through. They can't follow me there." "What about me?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine. "I don't know," she admitted, "but staying here isn't an option." Before I could respond, the shadows began to emerge from the forest, their forms twisting and writhing as they closed in. The woman opened the door and ran toward the tree, her movements frantic. I followed, the weight of the darkness pressing against me with every step. She reached the door and pushed it open, revealing a blinding light that spilled out into the clearing. She turned to me one last time, her face illuminated by the glow. "Thank you," she said before stepping inside. The door slammed shut behind her, the light vanishing as if it had never been. The shadows froze, their movements stuttering as they turned their attention to me. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. The car was too far, and there was nowhere to run. The largest figure stepped forward, its form towering over me. It reached out, and as its hand, or what passed for one, touched my shoulder, the world went dark. When I woke, I was sitting in my car, parked at the side of the highway. The sun was rising, casting a golden light over the landscape. The road was empty, no sign of the woman or the figures that had chased us. I checked the car, but there were no scratches, no dents, nothing to suggest the night's events had been real. And yet, when I looked at the passenger seat, I found something that hadn't been there before. A single black feather, its edges shimmering faintly in the morning light. Story 4. The first time I noticed something was wrong. It was barely a whisper. A small, subtle disturbance in the otherwise monotonous hum of my life. It started with the door to my apartment, a solid oak barrier I had grown accustomed to hearing creak in the same low tone every time it opened. One night, I returned home, turned the key, and the door swung open noiselessly. It wasn't a big deal. Maybe the hinges had loosened up, I thought. I let it go. Days passed, and other little things began to change. My reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed off. Not wrong, just slightly delayed. I would move my hand to my face, and my reflection would follow the motion a split second later. I told myself I was imagining it, that my eyes were tired from too many late nights. Then there was the tapping sound. It came in the middle of the night, soft but deliberate, coming from the wall just above my bed. At first, I thought it was my upstairs neighbor, maybe knocking something against the floor. But the rhythm was too specific. 3 taps, pause, 3 more taps. It happened every night at exactly 3:15 a.m. I started to dread the moment, lying in bed with my heart racing, counting the seconds until the sound would start again. I knocked back once, hoping it was just a game, but the tapping didn't return that night. It wasn't until the following week that I realized the sound had moved. Instead of coming from the wall, it now came from the ceiling. The taps were faster this time, frantic and uneven, like someone scratching desperately. Sleep became impossible. The bags under my eyes darkened. My coworkers commented on how tired I looked. I didn't tell them about the tapping or the fact that I had started seeing shapes out of the corner of my eye. Shadows where there shouldn't have been any. Movements that disappeared the moment I turned to look directly at them. My apartment felt smaller, the walls closer, the air heavier. Every time I unlocked my front door, I hesitated before stepping inside, holding my breath as if bracing for something to leap out at me. The final straw came on a rainy Tuesday night. I had come home late, drenched and exhausted. As I kicked off my shoes in the entryway, I heard the sound of breathing. It wasn't my own. It was coming from the living room. Slow, shallow breaths, like someone trying to remain perfectly quiet. My chest tightened, and I reached for the umbrella I had left by the door, holding it like a weapon. I crept toward the living room, the sound growing louder with each step. The lights were off, but the dim glow from the street lamp outside cast strange, flickering patterns across the walls. When I reached the threshold, I froze. A figure stood by the window, its back turned to me. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. My breath caught in my throat, and the figure began to turn slowly. I didn't wait to see its face. Dropping the umbrella, I bolted from the apartment, not stopping until I was in my car, locking the doors and fumbling with my phone to call the police. They arrived quickly, their lights flashing and cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope. 2 officers went inside while I waited in the hallway, trembling. They found nothing, no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone else had been there. I couldn't explain the figure, the breathing, the tapping. It all sounded absurd, even to me. I spent the night in a motel, my mind racing with questions and doubts. The next morning, I returned to my apartment, accompanied by daylight's false sense of security. Everything looked normal. My reflection in the mirror moved in perfect sync. The walls were silent. The shadows stayed where they belonged. But as I gathered my things to leave for work, I noticed something out of place. A single muddy footprint near the window where the figure had stood. It wasn't mine. Story 5. The first sign that something was wrong was the smell. It crept into my apartment one evening, subtle at first, like damp earth and rotting leaves. I chalked it up to the rainstorm outside and cracked a window to let the fresh air in, but the smell lingered, growing stronger with each passing hour. By the time night fell, it was so overpowering that I felt nauseous. I searched every corner of my apartment for the source, checking under furniture and inside closets, but found nothing. That night, sleep was impossible. The air felt thick, heavy, almost alive. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard faint whispers just on the edge of my hearing, unintelligible murmurs that made my skin crawl. The next morning, I called the landlord to report the smell, but he dismissed it as a plumbing issue and promised to send someone to check it out. Days passed, and the smell persisted. No matter how many candles I burned or windows I opened, it wasn't just the smell anymore. Objects began to move on their own. I would leave my keys on the kitchen counter, only to find them on the coffee table later. The chair at the dining table shifted slightly, its legs scraping against the floor in the middle of the night. Once, I came home to find all the cabinet doors in the kitchen were wide open, though I was sure I'd closed them that morning. Then came the knocking. It started faintly, barely audible, like someone tapping their fingernails against the walls. It wasn't constant, just sporadic enough to catch me off guard and send my heart racing. At first, I thought it was coming from my neighbors, but the knocks always seemed to follow me, moving from room to room as I walked. One night, as I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, the knocks came from directly behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. My reflection in the darkened TV screen looked pale and haunted. I barely recognized myself. The dreams began soon after. Vivid, unsettling visions of a dark figure standing at the foot of my bed, its face obscured by shadow. It never moved, just stood there, watching me as I lay paralyzed with fear. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around me like a cocoon. Each time I swore I could still feel its presence lingering in the room. A cold, oppressive weight pressing down on my chest. Desperation drove me to research the history of the building. I spent hours at the local library, poring over old newspapers and records. That's when I found it. A single article buried in the archives, dated decades ago. A man had lived in my apartment, a recluse known for his strange behavior. He'd gone missing one winter, and his body was never found. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, and some claimed the apartment had always felt wrong, as if it carried a lingering darkness. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. I set up cameras around the apartment, determined to capture evidence of the strange occurrences. For 2 nights, the cameras recorded nothing unusual, but on the 3rd night, I woke to find all the cameras smashed, their wires tangled and frayed, as if they'd been ripped apart by something with claws. The smell was unbearable now, thick and cloying, suffocating me as I lay in bed. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed a bag and left, moving in with a friend while I tried to figure out what to do. But the darkness followed me. The whispers grew louder, the knocking more persistent. My friend noticed it too, her expression turning to fear as she realized the haunting wasn't confined to my apartment. I knew then that it wasn't the apartment that was cursed. It was me. Whatever I had disturbed, whatever had taken notice of me, wasn't going to let go. Story 6. It began with the shadows. At first, they were just flickers at the edge of my vision. So subtle I thought they were tricks of the light. They moved when nothing else did, stretching too far or bending in ways that defied logic. I tried to ignore them, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. But then they started appearing in places shadows shouldn't be, against walls where no light source existed, pooling under furniture that wasn't there. I didn't feel afraid at first, just unnerved, like being watched by something that didn't belong. The second sign was the quiet. My apartment had always been filled with sound, traffic from the street below, the hum of the fridge, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. But over time, the noise seemed to fade. It wasn't silence. It was something deeper, as if the world around me was holding its breath. Even my own footsteps sounded muffled, like walking on the edge of a dream. One night, as I sat in bed trying to read, the quiet became oppressive. The air felt thick, pressing against my ears, and that's when I heard it. A soft scraping sound, like nails against wood. It came from the closet. My heart froze, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the building was settling, or a branch was brushing against the window. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, waiting. I left the closet door closed and turned on every light in the apartment. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The scraping became more frequent. Sometimes it was soft and slow, almost tentative, but other times it was frantic, like something desperate to get out. I stopped using the closet altogether, leaving my clothes piled on a chair instead. One night, I finally worked up the nerve to open it. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle, and when I pulled it open, nothing was there. Just a dark, empty space. I should have felt release, but instead, dread settled in my stomach like a stone. I started noticing other things. Objects weren't where I left them. My keys on the kitchen counter, a book I'd left on the nightstand, my shoes by the door. They'd moved just enough to unsettle me, but never enough to prove I wasn't imagining it. One morning, I found my bathroom mirror fogged over, even though I hadn't used the shower. Scrawled into the condensation were 3 words. Let me in. My chest tightened, and I stumbled back, knocking over a towel rod. By the time I turned back to the mirror, the words were gone. The shadows grew bolder after that. They no longer lingered at the edges, but loomed in corners, dark and heavy. Sometimes they moved when I stared directly at them, coiling and shifting like rubber hands. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I felt the mattress tip beside me. I froze, every muscle locked in terror, as if the weight of something invisible pressed down next to me. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, until the pressure disappeared hours later. That was when I started hearing the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible beneath the hum of the air conditioner. But as days passed, they grew louder, filling the room with a low, guttural murmur. It wasn't just one voice. There was many, overlapping and echoing in a language I didn't understand. The sound clawed at my sanity, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. Desperation drove me to research the building, looking for anything that could explain the haunting. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. Decades ago, a tenant had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Neighbors reported strange occurrences in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Shadows that moved on their own, voices in the night, objects vanishing. Her body was never found. One of the old articles included a photograph of her apartment. It was mine. Panic consumed me. I tried to cleanse the space, burning sage and reciting prayers I barely remembered. For a few days, the activity seemed to stop, and I dared to hope it was over. But then, late one night, the whispers returned, louder than ever. They seemed angry, filled with rage, and I felt the temperature plummet around me. The lights flickered, and I could see my breath in the air. The shadows gathered in the center of the room, twisting and writhing into a form. A figure, tall and indistinct, but unmistakably malevolent. It stared at me without eyes, its presence suffocating. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure stretched a hand toward me, and I felt an icy grip around my chest. The last thing I remember is darkness swallowing me whole. When I woke up, the apartment was empty, the shadows gone, but the feeling of being watched never left. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind, but even now, the shadows follow me. They linger in the corners of my vision, whispering promises I don't want to hear. No matter where I go, I can't escape them. They've let me live, but I know it's only a matter of time before they take me back. Soren. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't strong at first, just a faint hint of something metallic and sour that seemed to linger in the air, no matter how many candles I lit or windows I opened. I'd only just moved into the old house, lured by its charm and affordable price, but that smell made me uneasy. I convinced myself it was nothing, an old pipe perhaps, or mildew in the walls, but the feeling that came with it, that strange sensation of being watched, was harder to ignore. A Victorian relic perched at the edge of a forest. Its peeling paint and sagging roof gave it a haunted appearance that I found oddly appealing. The realtor had been vague about its history, mentioning only that it had been vacant for several decades. I didn't press for details. I wish I had. The first night passed uneventfully, though I woke several times with the distinct feeling that someone was standing at the foot of my bed. I would sit up, heart pounding, only to find nothing but shadows cast by the moonlight through the curtains. I told myself it was just my imagination, a symptom of moving into an unfamiliar place. But then the knocking started. It began on the second night, soft and rhythmic, as if someone were gently rapping on the walls. I searched the house from top to bottom, flashlight in hand, but found no source for the sound. It always stopped when I looked, only to resume the moment I settled back into bed. By the third night, the knocking grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by faint whispers that I couldn't quite make out. They seemed to come from inside the walls, a low murmur that grew louder as the hours dragged on. I tried ignoring it, telling myself it was just the house settling, but deep down, I knew better. On the fourth night, I decided to confront it, armed with nothing but a crowbar and a growing sense of dread. I pried open one of the walls where the knocking seemed the loudest. Dust filled the air as the old wood gave way, revealing a hollow space behind it. At first, I saw nothing but cobwebs and darkness. Then I found the box. It was small and wooden, intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. The smell I'd noticed when I first moved in was stronger here, emanating from the box as if it had been trapped inside for years. My hands trembled as I lifted it, the weight heavier than it should have been. I debated opening it, every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone. But curiosity won. Inside were photographs, black and white images of people I didn't recognize. Their faces were solemn, their eyes wide with what looked like fear. There were dozens of them, all staring directly at the camera, as though they were looking through it and straight at me. Beneath the photographs was a small, leather-bound book. Its pages were filled with scrawled handwriting, the words a language I didn't understand. But the drawings were clear enough. Depictions of people standing in circles, surrounded by symbols, their faces contorted in agony. That night, the house came alive. The knocking was everywhere, so loud it shook the walls. The whispers grew into wails, voices crying out in anguish. Shadows moved where no light should cast them, stretching and twisting across the room like living things. I tried to leave, but the doors wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't break. It was as if the house had trapped me, holding me prisoner within its rotting walls. In my panic, I turned back to the box, desperate for answers. The book was open, its pages flipping wildly as though an unseen hand was rifling through them. The photographs spilled out across the floor, and for the first time, I noticed something terrifying. One of the faces in the photos was mine. My heart stopped. I hadn't posed for this picture. I hadn't even existed when these were taken. But there I was, staring back at myself with the same wide-eyed fear as all the others. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding off the people who entered it. The whispers grew louder, forming words now, words I didn't want to hear. They called my name, over and over, a chant that seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the house. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by fear. Hours, maybe days. Time didn't seem to exist in that place. Eventually, the noises stopped. The shadows receded. The house grew quiet again. But it was a silence that felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I left the box where I found it, shoved the wall back into place, and fled the house the moment the doors unlocked. I didn't take anything with me. Not my belongings, not my phone. Nothing. I just ran. I don't know who owns the house now. I don't want to know. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the knocking, faint and distant, as if it's calling me back. I ignore it, but part of me knows the truth. The house isn't done with me yet. Story 8. It started with the job listing. Just a plain black and white flyer stapled to a telephone pole in the city. Caretaker needed for remote property. Generous pay. Minimal responsibilities. No contact name. Just a phone number scrawled at the bottom. I was desperate, broke, and out of options. So I dialed the number without hesitation. A man answered on the first ring. His voice was smooth, but cold. And after a few questions about my ability to live in isolation, he gave me the address. No interview. No paperwork. Just directions to a cabin deep in the mountains. I should have known something was wrong, but the promise of money drowned out my doubts. When I arrived, the place was everything you'd expect from an old mountain cabin. Wooden walls weathered gray by time, a steeply pitched roof, and windows dark as voids. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. A single sheet of paper lay on the porch, pinned down by a rusty key. Caretaker rules, It read, the rules were simple enough. Stay inside after sunset. Don't open the door for anyone. And never, under any circumstances, go into the basement. I laughed it off. Rules like these were made for teenagers in horror movies, not adults being paid an obscene amount of money to do nothing. I pocketed the key, walked inside, and started settling in. For the first few days, everything was fine. The cabin was stocked with food, water, and supplies. There was even an old TV that only got static, but I didn't mind. The solitude was almost comforting, a chance to breathe after months of chaos in the city. But then, on the fourth night, things began to change. It started with the noises, soft at first, like the creak of old wood settling. I ignored it, convincing myself it was just the house adjusting to the cool mountain air. But as the hours passed, the sounds grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps echoed from the floor above me, slow and deliberate. Though I knew I was alone, I stayed in bed, clutching a thin blanket, as if it could shield me from whatever was out there. Morning came, and the noises stopped. I searched the cabin top to bottom, finding nothing but dust and silence. The unease lingered, but I told myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me in the isolation. That night, I locked every door and window before climbing into bed, determined to sleep through whatever imagined horrors my brain conjured up. At around midnight, I heard the knock. It wasn't loud or frantic as 3 soft raps against the front door. I froze, remembering the rules. Don't open the door for anyone. The knocking came again. This time, a little louder. I crept to the window, peeking out through a gap in the curtains. There was no one there. My heart raced as I backed away, the knocking continuing with increasing intensity until it stopped all at once. The silence that followed was suffocating. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on the porch, leading from the forest to the door. They weren't human. Each print was elongated, the toes clawed like something out of a nightmare. I wanted to leave, but the nearest town was a 4-hour drive, and I hadn't seen another car on the way up here. The thought of being stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help, kept me rooted in place. Over the next few nights, the knocking became a ritual. Always 3 soft raps, always starting at midnight. I stopped checking the windows, stopped trying to rationalize it. I just sat in the dark, waiting for it to end. The 5th night was different. The knocking started earlier, just after sundown. This time, it wasn't at the door. It came from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath my feet. It was everywhere at once, a deafening cacophony that made the whole cabin tremble. I screamed, begging it to stop. And just as suddenly as it started, it did. But the silence didn't bring relief. It brought something worse. A voice, low and raspy, whispered my name from the shadows. I turned, but there was no one there. The next morning, I decided to check the basement. I know the rules said not to, but I needed answers. The door was locked, of course, but I found a crowbar in the shed and pried it open. The stench hit me first, a foul mix of rot and mildew. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness, flashlight trembling in my hand. The basement was empty at first glance, just a dirt floor and crumbling stone walls. But in the corner, half buried in the earth, I found a trapdoor. My instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, but curiosity overpowered fear. I pulled it open, revealing a tunnel that stretched deep into the ground. The air down there was colder, thicker, and as I shined my flashlight into the darkness, I saw them, dozens of figures, their bodies twisted and wrong, their eyes glowing faintly in the light. They were crawling toward me, their movements jerky and unnatural. I slammed the trapdoor shut and ran, not stopping until I was outside. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. The knocking continued, now accompanied by the whispers that came from every corner of the cabin. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed what little I could carry and left, abandoning the cabin and its cursed rules. But the thing about rules is, they exist for a reason. I didn't follow them, and now the knocking follows me. In every hotel room, every rented apartment, every friend's couch I crash on, it finds me. 3 soft raps, always at midnight, always accompanied by the faint sound of laughter in the distance. I don't know how much longer I can run. I don't know if there's anywhere left to hide. But one thing is certain. Whatever I let out of that trapdoor, it's never letting me go. Story 9. The ad was simple. Remote caretaker needed for an island property. Private. No questions asked. It sounded too good to be true. But I was desperate, so I called the number. A man with a calm, almost mechanical voice answered. After a short conversation, he sent me coordinates and promised a boat would be waiting for me at the harbor. No paperwork, no interview, just an unsettling lack of detail. I chalked it up to eccentricity and went along. When I arrived at the harbor, the boat was already there, a small motorized skiff with no captain in sight, just a laminated card taped to the seat. Start the motor. Follow the GPS. I hesitated but climbed aboard, starting the engine and heading out into the gray, choppy waters. The journey was uneventful at first, just miles of open sea and the faint smell of salt and decay. But as the island came into view, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold wind. The island was small, jagged cliffs surrounding a dense forest, with a single house perched precariously on the highest point. The house looked ancient, its dark silhouette jagged against the gray sky. As I docked and made my way up the path, I noticed the oppressive silence. No birds, no insects. Just the sound of my boots crunching against the gravel. The house was unlocked. And inside, it was surprisingly well kept. Modern furniture mixed with old, heavy wooden pieces. A note lay on the kitchen counter. Welcome. Do not leave the house after sunset. Do not light more than 1 candle at a time. Do not look out the windows after dark. Enjoy your stay. I laughed nervously, thinking it was some kind of elaborate prank. But the pay was good, and I was already there. I told myself it was just an old house with quirks. The first night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The second night, the rules started to make sense. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew thick and heavy, and the silence became unbearable. I lit a single candle, as instructed, and sat in the living room, trying to focus on a book I found in the study. Then came the whispers, faint at first, like wind through the trees, but soon distinct enough to make out words. They weren't in any language I recognized, a guttural, otherworldly sound that made my skin crawl. I ignored them, repeating to myself that it was just my imagination. But they grew louder as the night wore on, coming from every direction. The windows became impossible to ignore. Shadows flickered across the glass, shapes that didn't belong. I caught glimpses of long limbs, too many eyes, but I forced myself to keep my gaze down, clutching the book like it was my lifeline. The whispers stopped at dawn. On the third night, the whispers were joined by something worse. Knocks, slow, deliberate, echoing through the house as if something massive was testing the walls. They came from every direction. The doors, the windows, even the floors. I stayed seated, clutching the single candle, its light barely pushing back the encroaching darkness. Then the scratching started. It sounded like claws raking against wood, first at the front door, then the walls, and finally the ceiling. Something was above me, moving with an unnatural grace. My breath caught as I saw the ceiling boards bulge, as if something heavy was pressing down from above. I didn't sleep that night or the night after. By the fifth day, I was a wreck, jumping at every creak and shadow. That evening, as the sun set, I heard something new. A voice. It was coming from outside, calling my name in a perfect mimicry of my late mother. "Come out, sweetheart. It's safe now. Come out and see me." Tears streamed down my face, but I didn't move. I couldn't. The voice continued, shifting to other loved ones, my father, my sister, even friends I hadn't spoken to in years. Each voice was perfect, down to the inflection, but they were wrong. The tone was hollow, like a bad recording. The next morning, I found scratches on the walls, deep grooves that hadn't been there before. Something had tried to get in. On the seventh night, the candle flickered and died, despite being fresh. I scrambled to relight it, but the matches wouldn't spark. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating, and the whispers turned to scream. Shadows danced around me, impossibly fast, and the knocking became violent, shaking the house to its foundations. Then, silence, the whispers, the knocks, the screams, all stopped at once, and then I saw it. A face at the window, pale and distorted, with eyes that burned like coals. I froze, unable to look away, as it pressed its hands against the glass. Fingers too long, nails too sharp. Its mouth twisted into a grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The glass cracked but didn't break. Somehow, I survived until dawn, when the first light of morning touched the island. The thing at the window vanished, leaving only smudges where its hands had been. I packed my things and ran to the boat, not caring if I left anything behind. As I sped away from the island, I looked back only once. The house was still there, perched on its cliff, but now it seemed alive, as if it were watching me leave. I don't know what was in that house or why it let me go, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the whispers again. And when I look out my window, I swear I see the island in the distance, waiting for me to return. Story 10. I never believed in ghosts. I always dismissed the stories, the creepy rumors, the people who claim to hear strange sounds at night or see shadowy figures in the corner of their eye. It wasn't that I didn't have an imagination, quite the opposite. But I thought such things were best left to people who needed an excuse for their fear. But when I moved to Green Hollow, everything changed. It was supposed to be the perfect place for a fresh start. A quiet, remote village where the air was crisp, the people friendly, and the nights peaceful. I rented a small old cottage on the edge of town, overlooking a dense forest. It was a bargain, really. The landlord, an elderly woman named Mrs. Bennett, had warned me that the house had been empty for years and that I might hear a few strange noises. But she assured me it was nothing to worry about. The house had been her family's for generations, and no one had lived there since her late husband passed. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked my things, set up my home, and got to know the small town. The locals were kind enough, though some of them looked at me oddly, as though they were waiting for something. I didn't think much of it. Green Hollow was a place that had its own rhythm, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. But it didn't take long for the oddities to begin. It started with faint sounds in the middle of the night. Whispers, as though someone was speaking just beyond the reach of my hearing. At first, I assumed it was just the wind, or perhaps the creaking of the old house settling, but as the nights went on, the whispers grew louder. They were soft and unintelligible, but unmistakable. Then came the dreams. I began to have vivid nightmares, so real that I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, In the dreams, I was walking through the woods that surrounded the house, always moving deeper, further away from the safety of the cottage. There was a voice, a low, guttural sound calling my name, urging me to come closer. I would try to run, but my legs were like lead, and I could never escape. Each night, the dreams became more intense, more terrifying. One night, I woke up to a loud bang, like a door slamming shut. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and rushed downstairs to find the front door wide open. Despite having locked it before going to bed, the wind was howling, but there was no sign of anyone. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin, and looked around. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the entire area in darkness. I called out, but there was no answer. The whispers started again, this time louder, more urgent. I spun around, my eyes searching the trees, but saw nothing. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. That was the night I decided to ask Mrs. Bennett about the house history. I walked into town the next morning, still feeling shaken from the events of the night before. Mrs. Bennett was sitting in her rocking chair on the porch when I arrived, her eyes sharp and knowing, as if she had been expecting me. "You're having trouble sleeping, aren't you?" she asked without preamble. I nodded, unsure of how to explain the strange occurrences without sounding insane. She gave me a long, appraising look before sighing deeply. "I thought you might. It's always the same. The house, it's been here for centuries, but it's never been at peace. The land, too. There's something in the woods, something ancient. It doesn't like it when people come near." I stared at her, confused. "What do you mean? What's in the woods?" Mrs. Bennett's expression hardened, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's a spirit, or something worse. I don't know the details, but there's a curse on that place." My husband, before he passed, he did his best to keep it at bay. But after he died, the house has been drawing in things. It gets worse at night when the moon is hidden behind the clouds. I thought it wouldn't affect you, but I see I was wrong. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to say it was just an old woman's superstition. But the other part, the part that had been hearing the whispers and feeling the unease crawling beneath my skin, knew she was telling the truth. "What should I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me with pity, her eyes dark and tired. "Leave. Leave while you still can. No one stays in that house for long." That night, I didn't sleep. The whispers were louder than ever, almost deafening, filling every corner of the cottage. I hear them coming from the walls, from the floorboards, from the very air around me. It felt as if the house itself was alive, and it wanted me to hear its terrible secrets. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath as I sat huddled on the couch. I tried to ignore the noise, tried to pretend it wasn't happening. But then came the footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate steps. They echoed through the halls, growing louder and closer with each passing second. I stood up, my legs weak with fear, and slowly made my way toward the stairs. The footsteps followed just behind me. I dared not look over my shoulder. I reached the top of the stairs and froze. At the end of the hallway stood a shadow, tall and indistinct, just beyond the reach of the dim light from my upstairs window. My heart pounded in my chest, and my body refused to move. The shadow seemed to be watching me, waiting. I couldn't breathe, and then it moved. The shadow darted toward me with unnatural speed, and I screamed, turning and running down the stairs as fast as I could. I slammed the door behind me, my heart racing, and stumbled into the yard. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic. I ran into the woods, hoping to escape whatever was hunting me, but it was everywhere. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, pulling me deeper into the forest. I couldn't tell how long I had been running, but the world around me began to distort. The trees became blurred, and the sky above shifted from black to an eerie, sickly green. I stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath, and looked around. There was no path, no way out. The forest had swallowed me whole. And then, from the darkness, I heard it. A voice, deep and low, calling my name. I turned, and there, standing just beyond the trees, was the shadow. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had form, something human, but twisted. Its face a mass of writhing shadows and jagged features. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was paralyzed with terror. The figure took a step forward, its face contorting into a grotesque grin, and then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The last thing I remember before I blacked out was the overwhelming sense of dread that filled my entire being. When I woke up, I was back in the cottage, lying on the floor, the sunlight streaming through the windows. I could hear the birds singing outside, and for a moment I thought it was all a dream. But the air was still cold, and the whispers had stopped. I left Green Hollow the very next day. I packed my things in a daze and drove far away from that cursed place, never once looking back. And as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was still following me. Story 11. It was a small, insignificant house on the edge of town, the kind you wouldn't look twice at if you were just passing by. My girlfriend, Sarah, and I had moved in together after we graduated, hoping for a quiet place to start our lives. The house was cheap, almost too cheap for its location, but we didn't question it. The landlord, an old man with a craggy face and unsettlingly deep eyes, barely spoke when we signed the lease. He handed us the keys and left. The first few days were normal, even peaceful. The house was old, certainly. Its floorboards creaked, and the pipes groaned when we used the water. But it was nothing out of the ordinary. Sarah and I spent our evenings unpacking, organizing, and enjoying each other's company. But then, on the fourth night, I heard something. It was faint at first, just a soft scratching sound coming from behind the walls. I thought it was just the house settling, the usual creaks and groans that came with any old building. But the next night, the scratching came again, louder, more persistent. I asked Sarah if she'd heard it, but she hadn't. "You're just imagining it," she said, brushing it off. I wasn't so sure. It wasn't just the sound. It was the feeling, the unsettling sensation that something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck would stand up whenever the scratching started, and it always seemed to get louder when I was alone. I decided to ignore it, but the next night, it happened again. This time, the scratching was accompanied by something else, whispering, low, guttural whispers that sounded like they were coming from inside the walls. I froze, my blood running cold. The whispers were unintelligible, just a series of distorted syllables, but they were unmistakable. I got up and walked around the house, checking every corner, every room, but there was nothing. No source for the sound. I told Sarah about it the next morning, but again, she brushed it off. "You're stressing yourself out. You've been working late," she said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I wanted to believe her, to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more frequent, until they began to follow me throughout the house. At night, I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the persistent scratching and whispering coming from the walls. But it wasn't just the sounds. It was the eyes. I began to notice them, First out of the corner of my vision, small, glowing eyes peering at me from the cracks in the walls, from the space behind the bookshelves, from the shadows that pooled in the corners of the rooms. They were always watching, always waiting. I could never look directly at them, but I knew they were there. I told Sarah about them, but again, she dismissed it. "You're just exhausted. You need some rest," she insisted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that we weren't alone in the house. I started to lose sleep, to feel like I was being suffocated by the constant presence of something unseen. The eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went, their gaze cold and unblinking. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The scratching and the whispers were louder than ever, and the eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, were everywhere. I had to know what was behind the walls. I grabbed a crowbar from the shed and started prying up the floorboards in the living room. The scraping sound of the crowbar against the wood was almost drowned out by the whispers, which had grown louder and more frantic, as if they were urging me to stop. But I didn't. I had to know what was in there. The floorboards came up easily, revealing a dark space underneath. I shone a flashlight into the hole, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I saw nothing but the dust and debris that had accumulated over the years. But then, I saw it. Eyes. Eyes. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of tiny, glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. They weren't human. They weren't even animal. They were something else. Something ancient and wrong. I recoiled, stumbling back, my heart racing. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. The eyes blinked, one after another, and in that instant, I realized they were watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. I wanted to run, to get out of the house, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped by the eyes, by the whispers, by the overwhelming sense that I was no longer in control of my own body. And then, I saw it, a figure, cloaked in shadows, emerging from the dark space beneath the floor. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its skin was pale, stretched tight over bones that seemed to jut out at odd angles. Its face was a mass of shifting shadows, no features, just darkness. The eyes were the only thing that remained constant, glowing from the blackness like stars in a void. The figure reached out, its hand extending toward me. I screamed, finally breaking free from the paralysis, but it was too late. The hand was already on my shoulder, cold and clammy, and I felt my strength drain away as it touched me. The whispers grew louder, filling my mind, drowning out everything else. I tried to push the figure away, to escape, but my body wouldn't obey. I could feel the coldness spreading through me, seeping into my bones. The last thing I remembered before everything went black was the sound of Sarah's voice calling my name, distant and faint, as if she were miles away. When I woke up, I was back in bed, the house silent, the scratching and the whispers were gone. The eyes were no longer watching. Sarah was sitting beside me, her face pale and drawn. "What happened?" I asked, my voice hoarse. You were sleepwalking," she said, her voice trembling. "You were muttering something about the walls, and then you collapsed. I thought I was going to lose you." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe her, to tell myself that it had all been a nightmare, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The house was alive, and it wasn't done with me yet. I could feel it, deep in my bones, the coldness, the presence. The eyes were still there watching, waiting for the right moment to return. And when they did, I knew I wouldn't be able to escape. Story 12. I had never believed in the supernatural. Never thought much about things like ghosts or curses. That was until I moved into the old apartment on Oak Street. It wasn't much. Small, with peeling paint on the walls and a musty smell that no amount of cleaning seemed to fix. But it was cheap. I had just gotten out of a relationship, and the idea of a new place, a fresh start, seemed like exactly what I needed. I spent the first few days unpacking, setting up my things, trying to make the place feel like home. But there was something about the apartment that made me uneasy. Though I couldn't put my finger on it, it wasn't until the first night that I realized something was wrong. I had just finished eating dinner and was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels when I noticed it. The mirror in the hallway. It was an old, ornate thing, its edges carved with intricate designs, but the glass was cloudy, streaked with grime that no amount of cleaning could remove. At first, I thought it was just the lighting, but as I stared at the reflection, I saw something move behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the hallway was empty. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe the shadows playing on the wall. But the next night, it happened again. I was sitting on the couch, this time with a book, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. The mirror. There it was again, a figure moving behind me. I jumped to my feet, this time much faster than before, and rushed into the hallway. No one was there. My pulse was racing. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm down. Maybe I was just imagining things. I had been stressed lately. New place, new job, all that. But then I saw it in the reflection of the mirror. A figure was standing just behind me. A woman, tall and thin, her face obscured by dark hair that hung in front of her eyes. She wasn't there in the hallway, but she was in the mirror, staring right at me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was like the air had thickened, pressing down on me, suffocating me. My own reflection seemed to warp, like it wasn't quite mine, as if someone else was standing there instead of me. The woman in the mirror took a step forward. I gasped, my legs trembling, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. She moved slowly, deliberately, and with each step I felt my skin crawl. It was as if she was coming closer, as if the glass was no longer a barrier between us. Her face was still obscured by her hair, but I could feel her eyes on me, cold and empty. I backed away from the mirror, my breath shallow and rapid. I ran into the living room, trying to tell myself it was just a hallucination, just a trick of the mind. But the fear lingered, gnawing at me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind racing, replaying the image of the woman in the mirror over and over again. At one point, I even heard a soft whisper, like someone was calling my name. I bolted upright in bed, but there was nothing. Just the silence of the apartment. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. Stress, anxiety, lack of sleep. I was fine. I went to work, trying to put the whole thing behind me. But as soon as I walked back into the apartment, I felt it again. The unease, the creeping sense that something wasn't right. The mirror, it was like it was calling to me, beckoning me to look into it. I avoided the hallway, staying away from it as much as possible. But the next night, I found myself drawn to it again. I don't know why, but I couldn't help it. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. It looked normal enough, just me, tired from work. But as I looked closer, I noticed something. My reflection wasn't quite right. My movements were slightly off, as though it was a split second beyond mine. I stepped closer to the mirror, watching myself. Then, the reflection smiled. I froze, my heart stopping. I hadn't smiled. I hadn't moved my mouth at all, but there it was, my reflection grinning at me, its eyes wide with something dark. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The reflection stayed where it was, still smiling, still watching. I couldn't tear my eyes away, and for a moment I felt as though I was falling into the mirror, pulled in by that smile. But then it stopped. My reflection went still, and I was left staring at myself in silence. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to leave, to pack up and never look back. But I couldn't bring myself to. I felt trapped. The next few days, the strange occurrences only escalated. The whispering started again, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. I would hear it when I was alone in the apartment, sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes in the hallway. Sometimes it sounded like a voice calling my name. Other times like a soft murmur, like someone was speaking just out of reach. And always, it was the mirror. Every time I passed it, I felt that same cold, suffocating presence, as though it was waiting for me. I couldn't escape it. I tried to cover it up, to hide it, but it didn't help. The whispers grew louder, and the reflection, oh, the reflection. It was no longer just behind me in the mirror. It followed me. At night, I would catch glimpses of it from the corner of my eye. Always there, always watching, always moving. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, and see it standing at the foot of my bed. A shadow, darker than the darkness around it, just watching. I knew then that it wasn't just in the mirror. It was in the walls, in the air, in the very fabric of the apartment. I tried to leave, but I couldn't. I would pack my things, get ready to go. But when I reached the door, I would turn back, compelled to go back to the mirror. The woman in the reflection was still there, waiting. The last night I spent in that apartment was the worst. The whispering was deafening, the air thick with the presence of something ancient and malevolent. I stood in front of the mirror one last time, staring at my reflection. It was smiling again, that same dark, twisted grin. But this time it was different. The reflection stepped out of the mirror. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed with fear as I watched it approach me, its eyes glowing with a sickly light. It reached out a hand, and I could feel the coldness of it even from where I stood. It's time, it whispered, its voice like 1,000 other voices, all speaking at once. I screamed, but no sound came out. I turned and ran, but the apartment stretched out endlessly, the hallways twisting and shifting, as though the walls were alive, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the feeling of cold fingers wrapping around my wrist, pulling me back toward the mirror. I woke up in a hospital bed, my hands trembling, my mind fractured by the memory of what I had seen. The doctors told me I had a nervous breakdown, that I had been found unconscious in the apartment, but I knew the truth. The mirror had taken me. It wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway, and it was waiting for the next person to come through. And I knew, deep down, that it was still waiting, watching for me. Story 13. I'd always thought living in an old apartment building would be charming. The creaking floors, the vintage fixtures, the small quirks that came with age. It all seemed like part of the charm. I'd been living in the building for a few months now, and while it had its downsides, like the noisy plumbing and the thin walls, it had its appeal. The location was great, and the rent was affordable for the area. But it wasn't until a few weeks after I moved in that I began to notice something strange about my neighbors. At first, I didn't think much of it. I had a neighbor on the floor above me and another one next door, but I rarely saw either of them. The building was quiet, but that was normal, right? People are busy, and most of the time, the only sounds I heard were the faint hum of the refrigerator or the occasional thud of footsteps in the hallway. But then, I realized I hadn't heard a single sound coming from their apartments. No voices, no television, no footsteps, nothing. I'm not a nosy person, but curiosity got the better of me. I knocked on the door of the apartment next door, just to introduce myself. No answer. I knocked again, and after a long pause, I heard faint rustling from inside. I figured maybe they were busy or didn't want to be bothered, so I left it at that. But the silence gnawed at me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Weeks went by, and the odd stillness of the building became unsettling. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I would occasionally hear muffled sounds, like something heavy being dragged across the floor, or a chair scraping against the tiles. But it always stopped so abruptly that it felt unnatural, like it was being forced to end. I found myself growing anxious every time I heard those sounds. I even tried to talk to the neighbor above me, knocking on their door one evening. Again, no answer, though I could swear I saw a shadow move behind the frosted glass of the door. That's when I started to notice other oddities. I saw lights on in their apartments at night, but when I tried to speak to them during the day, no one was ever home. I became obsessed with it. I would sit by my window at night, watching the windows of the apartments across the hall, hoping to see some sign of life. But there was nothing. It was as if the other residents simply didn't exist during the day. One night, I decided to get to the bottom of it. I had enough. I waited until late in the evening, when everything in the building was eerily quiet. I grabbed my keys and made my way to the neighboring apartment, the one next door that I'd knocked on before. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the exit signs. I stood in front of the door, hesitating. The rustling sound I had heard earlier drifted through the thin walls, making my pulse race. I took a deep breath and knocked. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time. Silence. I was about to turn away when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps from inside the apartment, coming closer to the door. My heart skipped a beat. The door creaked open just a crack, and a face appeared in the narrow gap. It was a woman, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that didn't seem to blink. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity, her lips pressed tightly together. "Can I help you?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. I swallowed hard. I just wanted to introduce myself. "I live across the hall," I stammered. She didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at me, her eyes unblinking. It was like she was studying me, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "I haven't seen you around much," I continued, trying to break the silence. "Is everything okay?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she slowly shook her head, a subtle movement as if she was trying to decide whether or not to speak. After a long moment, she said, We don't like to be disturbed." Her voice was flat, emotionless. She closed the door without another word, and I was left standing there in the hallway, my mind racing. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. The encounter left me rattled. I went back to my apartment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The silence in the building had become suffocating, and the woman's words echoed in my mind. We don't like to be disturbed. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I decided to do a little digging. I went down to the building's laundry room, where I knew I could find some of the tenants. As I was folding my clothes, I overheard two older women talking in hushed tones. They were discussing the neighbors in the apartment next to mine. "Did you hear about the people in 3B?" one of the women whispered. No one's seen them in years. They don't leave the apartment, and nobody's ever allowed in. The other woman shushed her. Don't talk like that. You know what they say about that place? They both fell silent, exchanging wary glances. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. What were they talking about? I asked the women casually, trying to sound nonchalant. What do you mean by no one's seen them in years? The first woman hesitated, then whispered. The people who live there. I've been living there for a long time, but nobody really knows anything about them. It's like they never age. Always the same. It said they don't even need to leave their apartments. I don't know. It's just strange. I left the laundry room quickly, my head spinning. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I thought about going back to my apartment, but my curiosity got the better of me. I had to know more. I went back up to the third floor and stood in front of the apartment door. I pressed my ear to the door, listening intently. At first, there was nothing. Silence. Then, I heard faint murmurs, like voices talking in hushed tones. But there was no movement, no sounds of footsteps, no creaking floorboards. It was like the voices were coming from nowhere. I couldn't take it anymore. I tried the doorknob. It turned, but the door didn't open. It was locked, but it felt like something was pressing against it from the inside. I pulled my hand away and stepped back. That's when I noticed something, a small red stain near the base of the door frame, barely visible unless you were looking for it. It was fresh, like someone had spilled something. Blood. I stumbled back, my stomach churning. I had to leave. I had to get out. I don't know what happened to the tenants in 3B after that night. I moved out the next week, not bothering to look back. But sometimes, when I walk past the building on Oak Street, I can help but glance up at the windows. And sometimes, I swear I see a face staring down at me. A pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes, watching, waiting. Story 14. I had never really been afraid of old houses. In fact, I loved the character they held. Creaky floors, drafty windows, and the sort of charm that comes only with age. So when I found the old Victorian house for rent, I didn't think twice. It had been empty for years, the walls worn and faded. But it was affordable, and it felt like the perfect place for a fresh start. The first few days were uneventful. The house had that musty, stale air that only old buildings have, but a few candles and some air fresheners helped. I spent my time unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting to know the how's quirks. It was quiet, eerily so, and I began to find comfort in the solitude. But then, on the fourth night, something changed. It started with a noise, a soft scraping sound coming from above me. I stood still for a moment, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The attic. The house had an attic, though I'd never bothered to check it out. I'd been in the basement, explored the rest of the house, but the attic door was locked, and I hadn't thought much about it. I tried to brush it off as a mouse or something, but the noise persisted. It was faint, almost like footsteps, dragging along the floorboards above my head. I stood up from the couch, my pulse quickening. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a broom, just in case, though I couldn't explain why I felt so uneasy. I took the broom in hand and made my way to the stairs that led to the attic. The old wooden steps creaked beneath my weight as I climbed. The door to the attic was just as I had left it, old, weathered, with a rusty lock on it, but the scraping noises continued, louder now, more deliberate. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. What was making that sound? Why hadn't I heard it before? I unlocked the door with trembling hands and pushed it open. The attic was dark, the air stale and thick with dust. I couldn't see much, but I could feel the space stretching out above me, vast and empty. I stepped inside, the wooden floorboards groaning under my weight. I glanced around but saw nothing unusual. There were boxes, old furniture covered in sheets, but nothing seemed out of place. The sound had stopped, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. I felt stupid for being so paranoid, but as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A small old trunk, tucked away in the far corner of the attic. It slid half open. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I didn't remember seeing it when I first came up. My curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to it, my hand trembling as I reached for the lid. Inside, there was nothing but a bundle of old, tattered clothes. Some sort of brownish fabric. I leaned in closer, and then, beneath the clothes, I saw it. A small, leather-bound book. I picked it up, brushing off the dust, and opened it. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the handwriting was still legible. I began to read. The book was a journal of sorts. It seemed to belong to someone who had lived in the house many years ago, though the entries were vague, as if written in a hurry. At first it was just mundane details about the weather, about life in the house, but then the entries grew darker. I hear the scraping at night. I try to ignore it, but it won't stop. It's coming from above, from the attic. I think it's trying to get out. I froze. I turned the page. It's been following me, the thing in the attic. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. It's getting closer. I shuddered, my hands shaking as I read the words. The journal went on like that for pages, recounting strange noises, disturbing encounters, and the gradual descent into madness. But then the entries stopped abruptly, just as the last one read, "It's here." I slammed the book shut, my heart racing. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something was watching me. I spun around, but the attic was still empty. I had to get out. I bolted out of the attic, slamming the door behind me. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had just read. Who had written that journal? And what did they mean by, "It's here"? I tried to dismiss it as a relic of the past, a story left behind by someone who had let their imagination run wild. But then I heard it again, the scraping sound. This time, it was closer, and it was unmistakably a footstep. I froze. My breath caught it in my throat as I turned toward the stairs. Slowly, the scraping continued, moving down the steps. Someone or something was coming down from the attic. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The steps grew louder, closer, until I could hear them right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway stretching out before me. The air grew thick, oppressive, and the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in front of me, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of someone standing just behind me. I slowly turned around again, my heart pounding in my chest. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was a figure, a man. His face was pale, gaunt, and covered in dark, matted hair. He was dressed in old, ragged clothing, like something out of another time. His eyes were wide, empty, as if he hadn't seen the light of day in years. And he was smiling, a twisted, unnatural smile that made my stomach turn. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I had to get away from him, but my legs felt like lead. He started to move toward me, slow and deliberate, each step creaking beneath him. I turned and ran, not knowing where I was going, just needing to escape. I flew down the stairs and into the living room, but he was still there, following me. I could hear his footsteps echoing behind me, getting closer with every step. I reached the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. I finally got it open and bolted outside into the night. gasping for air. The cold night air hit me like a shock to my system, and I ran, not stopping until I was a few blocks away. I didn't look back. I didn't go back inside the house. I don't know what I saw that night, whether it was real or some trick of the mind. But I do know one thing. I can never go back to that house. The journal, the footsteps, the figure in the hallway. They haunt me. I still hear the scraping sometimes, late at night when I'm alone. And I know, deep down, that whatever was in that attic is still there, waiting, watching. Story 15. I had never been one for superstition. Growing up, I dismissed any talk of ghosts, haunted places, or curses. To me, it was all just nonsense. The building had a strange, old-world charm. Exposed brick, creaky floors, high ceilings. When I first heard it, everything seemed fine. The rent was reasonable, and the place had a view of the city skyline. So I took it without hesitation. It wasn't long before I realized that something was off. It started small, almost imperceptible. The lights flickered occasionally, the pipes groaned in the walls, and the air always felt too cold, no matter how high I turned the heat. But I shrugged it off. It was an old building, after all. The first real sign that something was wrong came one evening when I was getting ready for bed. I walked into the bathroom, turned on the light, and froze. The mirror, an antique piece framed in gold, reflected something that shouldn't have been there. I saw my own reflection, standing still in the bathroom, but there was something off about it. My reflection wasn't quite in sync with me. It moved just a fraction of a second after I did, like it was lagging behind, as if I was a few frames out of sync with it. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was just the dim light playing tricks on me. But when I moved, my reflection didn't. It stayed in place, staring at me with a cold, expressionless face. I quickly turned away, my heart racing. But I had to check. I looked back into the mirror, and this time my reflection was there, as it should be. But I still felt uneasy that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the apartment. Every time I turned a corner or glanced over my shoulder, I felt like something was watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but it felt too real to ignore. The next few days were more of the same. Strange noises at night, the feeling of being followed, and that constant sense of unease. But it wasn't until a week later that things escalated. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. Something had woken me, but I wasn't sure what. I sat up in bed, trying to steady my breath, when I heard it, a faint tapping, like fingernails on glass. I turned toward the bathroom, the sound coming from the mirror. My pulse quickened. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Slowly, cautiously, I got out of bed and approached the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, and the faint light from the hallway cast a dim glow into the room. I stepped inside, my eyes drawn to the mirror, and there it was, the reflection of myself, standing perfectly still, staring back at me. But this time, something was different. My reflection was smiling. A wide, unsettling grin stretched across its face, too wide for a normal smile. My eyes were empty, hollow, as though they were looking straight through me. I felt my throat tighten, my breath caught in my chest. I stumbled backward, but my reflection didn't move. It stayed grinning. "Get out," I whispered to myself, trying to break the eerie silence. But the reflection didn't respond. It just kept smiling, that grotesque grin never faltering. I backed away, my heart racing, and slammed the bathroom door shut. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I felt like I was going crazy. The reflection had been so vivid, so real, that I couldn't shake the image from my mind. But when I checked the mirror again, everything seemed normal. My reflection was exactly as it should be. No smiles. No empty eyes. It was as if the events of the night before had never happened. But I knew better. Something was wrong. That afternoon, I went out and bought new locks for the apartment, even though I knew it wouldn't help. I was desperate for some sense of control, but deep down, I knew the real problem wasn't with the locks. It was with the mirror. I could still feel its presence in the apartment, lurking just beyond my sight. That night, the tapping came again, but this time it was louder, more frantic. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, as the tapping echoed through the room. It wasn't coming from the mirror anymore. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. A low, rhythmic tapping, like something was trying to break through. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to get up, didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I had to know. Slowly, I crept out of bed and moved toward the bathroom. The door was shut, but the tapping, no, the scratching was louder now, like something was trying to claw its way out. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I opened the door and froze. The bathroom was empty, the mirror in front of me reflecting nothing but the empty room. But the scratching continued. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room, searching for the source of the sound. And then I saw it. The mirror. It was no longer reflecting the room behind me. Instead, it reflected a hallway, an unfamiliar, dark hallway, with doors that led to nowhere. The scratching was coming from within the mirror itself, like something was trapped on the other side. My reflection moved in the mirror, but it wasn't me. It was something else, something that looked like me, but wrong. The figure in the mirror began to scratch at the glass, its fingernails dragging across the surface, leaving deep gouges behind. It bared its teeth, grinning that same sick, twisted grin. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you want?" I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. The figure in the mirror didn't answer. It only continued to smile. Its hollow eyes locked on mine, as if it were enjoying my terror. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as though it were desperate to get out. And then, with a final deafening crack, the glass of the mirror shattered. I screamed, stumbling backward. But when I turned to run, I saw it. The figure was standing right behind me. It was me, or at least it looked like me. Pale, hollow-eyed, grinning in that same twisted way. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It reached out with its cold, skeletal hand and grabbed my arm. Its touch sent an icy chill through my body. "You can't leave," it whispered, its voice low and raspy, like a dying breath. I fought to pull away, but its grip was like iron. "Iron! Ah, I'm here now," it said, its grin widening, its eyes gleaming with hunger. "And I'm not going anywhere." Story 16. There was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and nothing ever seemed out of place. When I moved there, I thought it would be a quiet, peaceful life. The house I rented was old, a century old, in fact, but charming in its own way. A Victorian-style home with large windows, creaky wooden floors, and a fireplace that looked like it belonged in a history book. I was used to older homes, so I didn't think much of it. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked, cleaned, and settled in, enjoying the solitude. The house had an odd energy about it, though. Not bad, just strange. It felt like the walls were watching me, listening to my every move, but I dismissed it as my imagination. That night, after settling in, I decided to explore the house. It was large, with multiple rooms on each floor, and the layout was a bit odd. As I wandered from room to room, I discovered a door I hadn't noticed before. It was tucked behind a large bookshelf in what I thought was a closet. Curious, I pulled the shelf away and found a narrow, dark hallway. The door at the end was heavy, wooden, and had a lock on it. I tried the handle, but it was locked tight. There was something unnerving about the door, though I couldn't explain why. I didn't think much of it at the time. But over the next few days, that door became a constant source of fascination. Every time I passed by it, I felt an odd pull to open it, to see what was behind it. But something always stopped me. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I finally gave in to my curiosity. I found an old key in a drawer in the kitchen, one that looked like it hadn't been touched in years, and with a trembling hand, I unlocked the door. What I found behind it wasn't a room, but a long, narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air that hit me was cold and musty, the smell of old wood and something else, something I couldn't place. I hesitated for a moment, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I descended the stairs slowly, the wooden steps creaking beneath my weight. As I reached the bottom, I saw that the hallway stretched out in front of me, dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were old, covered in peeling wallpaper. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I walked cautiously, the floorboards groaning underfoot. The hallway felt endless, like it went on forever. But there was something else. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Soft, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. A low, rhythmic tapping, like something was knocking from inside the walls. At first I thought it was just the house settling, but the sound grew louder, more distinct, and then it was no longer a tapping. It was scraping, like claws against wood. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't alone down here. I could feel it. I tried to turn back, but my feet wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, my mind racing with questions. What was down here? What was making that sound? My breath quickened, and I could feel the cold sweat gathering on my skin. The scraping sound was getting louder, closer. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I stood there in the silence, unable to move, unsure whether to go forward or run back up the stairs. But something inside me urged me to keep going. I didn't want to, but I couldn't resist. I took a few hesitant steps forward, my eyes darting around the dark hallway, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes seeming to follow me as I moved. I felt a chill wash over me as I passed by one of them, the image of a man whose face was twisted in an unnatural grin. I shivered, but I kept moving. The hallway led to another door, smaller and unmarked. It was slightly ajar, and as I reached for the handle, I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I opened the door. What I saw made my stomach churn. The room was small, almost claustrophobic, and in the center of it was a small wooden table. On the table, there was a pile of old yellowed newspapers, and beneath them, something that looked like a book. But it wasn't a book. It was a collection of torn pages, scrawled with handwriting that I couldn't understand. The floor around the table was covered in dust, except for one small patch where the dirt had been disturbed, as if something had been moved recently. And then I saw it, a figure, barely visible in the shadows, standing in the far corner of the room. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was tall, thin, and its features were indistinguishable, like a shadow that had taken shape. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was watching me. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. and then I heard it again. The tapping. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The figure was gone. I rushed back to the door, but when I tried to open it, I found it locked. I tugged at the handle frantically, but it wouldn't budge. The walls around me felt like they were closing in, the air growing heavier, suffocating. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trapped inside the walls, trying to get out. Panic surged through me, and I pounded on the door, shouting for help. But there was no answer. I was alone. Alone with whatever was in the walls. Suddenly, the floor beneath me gave way. I tumbled down into darkness, the world spinning around me. I hit the ground with a thud, pain shooting up my spine. I lay there, stunned, trying to catch my breath. When I looked up, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the dark, was the figure, standing over me, watching me with those empty, hollow eyes. And then I heard the voice, low, raspy and whispering from the walls. You shouldn't have come. Story 17. When I moved into the apartment on Maple Street, I was looking for a fresh start. My life had been a mess for a while. Work, relationships. Everything felt like it was falling apart. I found the apartment through a friend of a friend, and it seemed perfect. The rent was cheap, the building was old, but well kept, and it was in a quiet neighborhood, far from the noise and chaos I was used to. The landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Harrison, was kind enough. He showed me around the place, explaining the rules and giving me the key. It's a lovely building, he said. Been around for decades, you know. Used to be a hotel back in the day. Plenty of history here. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just wanted to move in and get settled. The apartment was small but cozy, with hardwood floors and high ceilings. There was a large bay window in the living room that looked out over the street, and the bedroom was just big enough for a bed and a small desk. It felt like a good place to clear my head. The first few days were quiet. I unpacked, rearranged the furniture, and went about my daily routine. But there was something about the building that felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a strange feeling in the air. Like I wasn't alone, even when I was. The other tenants were nice enough, but I didn't interact with them much. I kept to myself. But one night, about a week after I moved in, I heard something. It was late, after midnight, and I was sitting on the couch watching TV. The building was eerily quiet, as it always was. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping sound. At first, I thought it was the pipes. Old buildings like this have their quirks, right? But then it kept going. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from somewhere above me. My first instinct was to ignore it. It could have been anything, I told myself. But the sound continued, persistent and unnerving. I grabbed my phone and texted my neighbor upstairs, asking if everything was okay. No response. I texted again. Still nothing. After a few minutes, I decided to go upstairs and check. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I was growing more uncomfortable by the second. When I reached the second floor, I knocked on the door of apartment 2. I knocked again. Still no answer. I tried the door handle, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. The door creaked open on its own, and I stepped inside. The apartment was dark, but I could just make out the shape of a chair in the living room. The thumping sound had stopped, but a low, guttural hum filled the air now. The sound seemed to be coming from the far end of the apartment. I hesitated for a moment before walking down the hallway toward the source of the noise. It was strange. There was no one there, no sign of anyone living in the apartment. The kitchen was empty, the living room untouched. But then, in the back of the apartment. I saw it. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and the hum was louder now, almost unbearable. I walked forward slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed the door open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, lying in the center of the bed, was a figure. A man. He was covered in blankets, but his face was obscured by his dark hair, which hung over his eyes. The humming came from him, a deep, throaty sound that sent chills down my spine. I froze, unsure of what to do. "Excuse me?" I called out, my voice shaking. The man didn't move. The humming continued, steady and rhythmic. I stepped closer, but something about the situation felt wrong, unnatural. I took another step, and that's when I noticed it. His skin was pale, almost ghostly white, and his hands were twisted at unnatural angles. He wasn't breathing. He couldn't have been. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow, my mind racing. I turned and bolted out of the apartment, not bothering to close the door behind me. I ran down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, and didn't stop until I was back in my own apartment. I locked the door behind me and sat on the couch, trying to calm myself. I must have imagined it, I thought. It had to be a dream, but no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the image of that man haunted me. The next morning, I went to Mr. Harrison's office. I had to ask about the apartment upstairs. I didn't want to seem crazy, but I couldn't shake what I had seen. Mr. Harrison was sitting behind his desk, his glasses perched on the tip of his nose, reading a newspaper. He looked up when I entered. "Good morning, miss. How can I help you?" I wanted to ask about the apartment upstairs," I said, my voice trembling. "Is someone living there?" Mr. Harrison raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Apartment 2?" he asked. "No one lives there. It's been vacant for years." "It's been vacant for years." I felt my stomach drop. But I was just there. I saw a man in the bed. He was humming. Mr. Harrison's face remained calm, but his eyes narrowed. "That apartment has been empty for years. No one's been up there since the last tenant passed away." "The last tenant?" I asked, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. "Yes. A few years ago. A man. He was very reclusive, never spoke to anyone. One night, he just stopped coming out of his apartment. The authorities found him, but by the time they got there, it was too late." Mr. Harrison's voice dropped lower, and he leaned in closer. "They say he never left, that he still roams the building, trapped between worlds." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to leave, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. "You need to be careful," Mr. Harrison warned. "The building has a way of keeping its tenants, even the ones who think they're gone." I left his office in a daze, my mind reeling with the implications of what he had said. That night, I didn't sleep. The building felt different now, heavier, suffocating. I heard footsteps in the halls, the faint hum of something not quite human. The next day I packed my things and left, never looking back. I couldn't stay in that building, knowing what I knew. As I drove away, I glanced back one last time. The building stood there, dark and silent, but I could have sworn I saw a figure in the window. Just there, staring. Story 18. It started on a Tuesday, the kind of day when nothing special was supposed to happen. I was at a thrift store looking for a new mirror. My old one had cracked, and I needed a replacement. I wasn't expecting much, just something simple to hang above my dresser. The store was tucked away in a quiet part of town, the kind of place that smelled like old wood and dust. I didn't think much of it when I saw the mirror at first. It was just sitting there in the corner, almost hidden behind a rack of clothes. It was old, framed in tarnished silver, but there was something about it that caught my attention. The glass was smooth, pristine, not a single scratch or imperfection on it. It looked almost too perfect. I walked over, and the moment I stood in front of it, I felt a chill run down my spine. The reflection staring back at me wasn't my own. It was slightly different, as if the mirror was showing a version of me that wasn't quite right. The angle of my face was off, my eyes a little too wide, my lips twisted in a way that made me look almost like I was smiling. But I wasn't smiling, I was just standing there, staring at my reflection. The feeling of unease grew stronger, and I quickly turned away, convinced it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe it was the lighting in the store, I thought. I picked up the mirror and walked to the counter, ignoring the nagging sensation that something was wrong. The shopkeeper was an older woman, her face kind, but tired. "That's an interesting choice," she said as she wrapped up the mirror for me. "Not many people go for mirrors like that anymore." I nodded, too distracted to respond. As I left the store, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about that mirror, but I shrugged it off. I bought it, and I wasn't going to waste my money. That night, after setting it up above my dresser, I couldn't stop staring at it. The reflection seemed to shift in subtle ways, as though it were alive, adjusting itself to fit some unknown purpose. I shook my head, trying to focus on something else, but every time I glanced at the mirror, I saw it again. My reflection was different, more menacing, more wrong. It wasn't just the smile anymore. Now, it was my eyes. The eyes, they were too dark, too hollow, and I couldn't look away. I tried to go to sleep, but the image of my own reflection haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see it, watching me, waiting. I tossed and turned for hours, the feeling of being watched never leaving me. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread that I couldn't explain. The mirror was still there, but it looked different. The surface of the glass seemed to ripple slightly, like water disturbed by a stone. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. This time, when I looked into the reflection, it wasn't me at all. It was someone else. A figure stood in the reflection, their face obscured by shadows, but I could see the outline of their form. They were tall, with dark hair and a thin frame, but there was something about them that made my blood run cold. They were staring right at me. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out a hand to touch the glass. The moment my fingers made contact, the reflection moved. It wasn't like a normal reflection. It was more like the figure was reaching back through the mirror, pulling something towards it. I yanked my hand away, stumbling back, my mind racing. What was happening? The mirror had to be broken. That was the only explanation. But it didn't feel broken. It felt alive. Over the next few days, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. The reflection in the mirror was changing, becoming more and more distorted. I would catch glimpses of the figure behind me, standing just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Every time I walked past the mirror, I could feel the figure's presence, like they were just waiting for me to turn around. And then, one night, it happened. I woke up in the middle of the night, unable to breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I could hear a faint whispering sound coming from the direction of the mirror. I sat up, my eyes darting to the corner of the room. The figure was there, standing in front of the mirror, watching me with those dark, hollow eyes. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze pressing down on me, like it was pulling me in. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get rid of the mirror. The next morning, I packed it up and drove to the nearest dumpster, not caring about the cost or how much I had paid for it. I was done. As I threw the mirror into the trash, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But it wasn't over. That night, I heard the whispering again. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, more insistent. The voice seemed to be calling my name, but I couldn't make out the words. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. I sat up in bed, my eyes wide open, and then I saw it, the mirror. It was back. Somehow, it had found its way back into my room, leaning against the wall where it had been before. My heart raced as I stared at it, unable to look away, and then, in the reflection, I saw the figure again. But this time, it wasn't just standing there. It was moving closer, its hand reaching out toward the glass. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure's hand touched the glass, and as it did, the mirror seemed to pulse, the surface rippling like water. I felt a cold hand brush against my cheek, and I screamed. The reflection smiled. It wasn't me anymore. It wasn't anyone I recognized. It was just a twisted version of me, smiling back through the glass. The figure's voice whispered from the depths of the mirror. You can't escape. I turned and ran, but I could still hear it, its voice calling my name, the laughter echoing in my mind. I never went back to that apartment. I moved far away, to a different city, hoping to leave the memories behind. But sometimes, when I pass by a reflective surface, I catch a glimpse of it. My reflection, twisted and wrong, standing just behind me, watching, and I can hear the whispers. Story 19. It all started with a sound. A strange, faint scratching noise coming from beneath the floorboards in my bedroom. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. The old wood, the creaks, the inevitable noises that come with living in a century-old house. But then it started happening every night. At exactly 3:03 a.m., without fail, a soft, rhythmic scratching sound beneath the floor. It wasn't loud enough to be disturbing at first, just enough to make me curious. I tried to ignore it, but as the days passed, it grew more persistent. I started to hear other noises too, whispering, low murmurs that seemed to seep up from the cracks in the wood, just beyond the reach of my hearing. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel their presence, like something was trying to communicate with me. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the house was haunted, I thought, but deep down I knew something was wrong. It wasn't until the night I decided to investigate that I realized just how wrong it was. It was a Friday evening, and I had gotten no sleep the night before, too restless to stay in bed with the constant scratching coming from below. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and some tools, determined to find the source of the noise. The room was pitch black except for the faint light from the flashlight. I got down on my hands and knees and began inspecting the floorboards. The scratching was louder now, almost like something, or someone, was trying to dig their way up. I pried up a floorboard near the corner, my hands shaking. There was nothing there at first, just dust and old wood. But as I shone the flashlight deeper into the gap, I saw something. At first, it looked like a shadow, just a dark, shifting shape. But as I stared at it, I realized it was more than that. It was something alive, moving, writhing beneath the floor. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a massive darkness, an entity that seemed to pulse with malice, pressing up against the wood, pushing against the floorboards. like it was trying to break free. I froze, my heart racing. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was paralyzed. The shadow beneath the floor grew more pronounced, as if it could sense my fear, as if it was feeding off it. And then, the whispers started again. They were clearer now, the words distinct, but they were in a language I couldn't understand. It wasn't English or any language I had ever heard. It was a guttural, ancient sound, like the rasp of 1,000 voices echoing through the walls. And then I saw it, the thing beneath the floor. The darkness began to take shape. It wasn't human, not even close. It was a mass of shifting shadows, tendrils that seemed to curl and stretch out from the center, writhing like serpents. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were two glowing orbs of sickly yellow light, burning through the darkness. I wanted to run, to get out of the room, but my body wouldn't move. I couldn't look away from those eyes. They were drawing me in, like they were calling to me, pulling me deeper into the shadows. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices pleading, urging, demanding that I come closer. It was then that I realized something terrible. The creature beneath the floor wasn't just trying to break free. It was trying to get me. It was waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for me to get too close. And I had. The floorboards beneath me creaked, and I felt something cold and clammy brush against my skin. I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat. The creature was closer now, its tendrils inching toward me, its eyes never leaving mine. I tried to scream, to call for help, but no sound came out. I was frozen, trapped in the grip of whatever this thing was. The shadows around me began to swirl, filling the room, choking out the light. I could feel the presence of the creature all around me now, its cold breath on my skin, its whispers in my ear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The shadows receded, the whispers stopped, and the room was still. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature, whatever it was, had vanished. I was alone again, or at least I thought I was. But the terror didn't end there. Over the next few days, things started to happen, strange, unexplainable things. My reflection in the mirror began to change, subtly at first. It was like the person staring back at me wasn't quite me. My eyes were darker, my expression twisted, as if the reflection was mocking me. I tried to ignore it, but every time I looked, I could see it, the thing in the mirror, staring at me with those same yellow eyes. And then, the shadows started to move. I would wake up in the middle of the night, only to find the walls of my room darkened, the shadows stretching and curling around the furniture, like living things. It was as if the creature had somehow followed me, lingering just out of sight, always present, always waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. I moved out of the house, packed up what little I could carry, and left everything behind. But even now, I can still feel it. The darkness, the whispers, the presence of that thing beneath the floor. I moved to a new place, far away from the old house, but I can't escape it. The shadows are still there, always lurking, always watching. I can hear the scratching again, faint at first, but growing louder every night. And I know that one day it will find me, that thing beneath the floor, the creature in the shadows. It's still waiting, and when it finally breaks free, it won't be just the floor it escapes from. It will be me. Story 20. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. Just a regular road trip to clear my mind after a stressful week of work. I'd been driving for hours, lost in thoughts, when I saw the sign. Rest area. 3 miles. I hadn't seen a rest area in what felt like forever, and I was starting to feel the weight of the road, so I decided to pull off. The rest area was tucked into the woods, off the main highway. It wasn't much, just a small parking lot, a couple of picnic tables, and a worn-out building that looked like it hadn't seen any maintenance in years. But I didn't mind. I needed to stretch my legs. The air was cool, and I welcomed the silence of the place, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I parked the car and got out, stretching my arms above my head, enjoying the relief. As I made my way toward the building, I noticed something strange. There was no one else around. No cars in the lot. No people sitting at the tables. It was odd, but I didn't think too much of it. I pushed open the door to the building, and the musty smell hit me instantly. The lights flickered above, casting strange, shifting shadows across the room. It was deserted. There was no one at the counter. No one in the bathrooms. It was like the place had been abandoned, but I hadn't seen any signs saying it was closed. I wandered further inside, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The place was too still, too empty. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to just leave and continue my trip. But I didn't want to be rude. I took a seat at one of the tables, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It came from the far corner of the building, just beyond the restrooms. I turned, straining to hear. It was a rhythmic tapping sound, like someone was knocking gently on the wall. It was so quiet at first, I thought it might have been the wind or the building settling. But then it came again. Tap, tap. It wasn't the wind. I stood up and walked cautiously toward the source of the noise. As I got closer, I noticed a small door at the end of the hallway, one that I hadn't seen when I entered. It was cracked open just a little, the darkness beyond it like a void. The tapping sound seemed to be coming from behind that door. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small, barely large enough to fit a cot and a few shelves. It looked like a storage area, filled with old cleaning supplies and unused furniture. But then I saw it. In the corner of the room, lying motionless on the cot, was a person. They were covered by a thick blanket, but their feet stuck out from beneath it, bare and pale. They looked wrong. Their skin was too pale, almost translucent, and their limbs were unnaturally still. I should have turned around then. I should have left, but something kept me there, rooted to the spot. The tapping continued, though it seemed to be coming from beneath the blanket now, like something was trying to escape from underneath. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. There was something about them that made my stomach churn. Something about their stillness that seemed too unnatural. I stepped closer, my breath coming faster now. Unsure of what I was doing, I reached out a hand, hesitant, and touched the edge of the blanket. That's when it happened. The figure in the bed shifted. It was so subtle at first, just a twitch of the fingers, but then it jerked, as if waking from a deep sleep. My blood ran cold. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure sat up slowly, their head jerking to one side as though the movement was painful. The tapping sound stopped, replaced by a low, raspy breathing noise. I stared at them, frozen in place. Their face was covered by a mass of tangled hair, but I could still make out the outline of their features. And then, they turned toward me. Their eyes were wide open, but they were empty, dark. black as coal. The eyes seemed to see right through me, as if they were staring into something beyond my body, beyond my soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The figure slid off the cot and stood up, its limbs stiff and unnatural. It took a step toward me, its movements jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. The tapping started again, louder this time, coming from beneath the skin. It was as if something inside the figure was trying to break free. My mouth went dry. I could barely keep my eyes open, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from the figure. Its lips parted, but no sound came out. It was like it was trying to speak, but the words were stuck inside. The air around me grew colder, and I could feel the weight of something heavy pressing down on me, pushing me onto the floor. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave, to run as fast as I could, but I was rooted to the spot. The figure reached out toward me, its hand trembling as it drew closer. I tried to move, tried to step back, but my body wouldn't obey. The hand closed around my wrist, icy cold, sending a shock of terror through me. I felt the fingers tighten, almost painfully, as the figure leaned in closer. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The figure released me, stumbling back and collapsing to the floor. I stood there, breathless, unsure of what had just happened. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, the figure began to get up again, its movements jerky. But this time, it didn't approach me. It just stood there, its empty eyes locked onto mine. I backed out of the room, my heart still racing, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. I stumbled toward the door, not daring to look back, and fled into the night. I never stopped at another rest area again, and every night, without fail, I hear that tapping sound. It starts softly at first, like distant knocking, but it gets louder every time. I've tried to ignore it, tried to pretend it's just my imagination. But I know the truth now. Whatever was in that room, whatever I saw, it's still out there, and it's coming for me. Story 21. I always thought I knew what fear felt like. Late-night horror movies, close calls in the dark, even the occasional jump scare from an unexpected noise. But nothing had prepared me for the night it happened. It was the kind of night where the air was thick, stifling, like the world itself was holding its breath. The clock had just struck midnight when I heard the first knock. I was sitting on the couch in my apartment, trying to unwind from a long day at work. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the soft rustling of the trees outside. I wasn't expecting anyone. My friends had stopped by earlier, but now the place was quiet, peaceful even. I didn't think much of the knock at first. It was faint, almost too soft to hear, and I assumed it was just the wind playing tricks. But then it came again, louder this time. 3 distinct raps on my door. I froze. My heart rate picked up, but I told myself it was probably just a neighbor or someone who had the wrong apartment. I wasn't expecting visitors, but it wasn't impossible for someone to be at my door. I got up and walked toward the door, trying to steady my breathing. As I approached, I felt an unsettling chill in the air, like something wasn't right. I looked through the peephole, but no one was there. Just an empty hallway. I frowned, turning the deadbolt to open the door. No one. I glanced down at the floor to make sure I hadn't missed a note or something, but there was nothing. The hallway was dark, silent. I stepped outside and looked both ways, but I was alone. It was as though whoever had knocked had vanished into thin air. I shook my head, dismissing it as a strange coincidence. Maybe a neighbor had knocked by mistake, but as I turned to go back inside, I heard it again. This time from inside my apartment. A soft, rhythmic knock on my bedroom door. My blood ran cold. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. I had locked the door behind me when I left earlier. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly turned around. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I moved toward the bedroom, my feet dragging like they were caught in thick mud. The closer I got to the door, the harder it became to breathe, as though the air itself had turned suffocating. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling, and slowly opened it. The room was empty. Nothing was out of place, but something felt wrong. The room was colder than the rest of the apartment, and I felt an unease crawling up my spine. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room. The knock came again, this time louder, as if it was coming from within the walls. I spun around, my mind racing. There was no way. A sound echoed in the silence, the rhythmic thud like something was trying to break through. Panic started to bubble inside me. I had to get out. I backed away from the door, feeling my way to the hallway. But as I turned to leave, I caught sight of something in the corner of the room. A shadow. A figure. At first, I thought it was my own reflection, but it wasn't. This thing was too tall, too thin. Its limbs unnaturally long. It stood perfectly still in the corner, watching me. My breath hitched, and I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me. It was like it was waiting for something. I stumbled out of the room, closing the door behind me and locking it, but the feeling didn't go away. The air felt wrong. Heavy, thick, like I was being smothered. The knocking continued. Louder now, more forceful. It was coming from all around me. I tried to stay calm, to think rationally. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. This wasn't a dream. Something was here. The knocking intensified, turning into a rapid series of bangs, as if the walls themselves were trembling. I covered my ears, but the sound was relentless. Then, the lights flickered, and the door to my bedroom slammed open. I didn't know what to do. My legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. And then, the voice came. It was low, guttural, a rasping whisper that seemed to seep into my mind. Let me in. I turned to face the bedroom door. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see its eyes. Wide, white, and unblinking. They stared at me, empty, like there was nothing behind them, nothing human. It opened its mouth, and I could feel its presence in my mind. Let me in, it repeated, its voice echoing in my skull. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was trapped, cornered by this thing. The knocking was deafening now, coming from every wall, every direction, as if the very house was alive. It moved closer, its long fingers reaching out for me. Let me in, it whispered once more. And then, in the next moment, it was gone. The house was still. The knocking had stopped. I stood there in the silence, my heart pounding, unsure of what had just happened. I didn't know if it had been real or if I had imagined it. But I could still feel it, its presence lingering in the air. The next day, I moved out of the apartment. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had visited me was still there, waiting, watching. I left in a hurry, not even bothering to pack most of my things. It didn't matter. The house was gone, and I was never going back. But I still hear the knocking sometimes. In the dead of night, when I'm alone, I hear it. 3 knocks, and then silence. Story 21. It was a weekend getaway. The kind of trip I'd promised myself I'd take for years but had never gotten around to. A small, secluded cabin by the lake, far away from the city's noise and distractions. The perfect place to relax, clear my head, and recharge. The cabin was old, rustic, and charming. There were no neighbors for miles, just the peaceful silence of nature surrounding me. At least that's what I thought. I arrived on a Friday evening, just as the sun was setting. The sky was a mix of deep purples and oranges, and the lake looked like a mirror reflecting the last rays of daylight. The air was cool, and the scent of pine and earth filled my lungs. I unpacked my bags, settled in, and started a fire in the small fireplace. The first night passed without incident. I made myself a simple dinner, read a book, and enjoyed the quiet. The isolation was strange at first, but it felt good. I went to bed early, listening to the sounds of the night outside. Crickets, rustling leaves. Crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional splash of a fish in the lake. Hello. The second day, I decided to take a walk through the woods. The forest was thick with trees, the ground soft and damp beneath my boots. I walked for hours, exploring the area around the cabin. The beauty of the place was undeniable, but as I ventured deeper into the woods, a strange feeling began to settle in the pit of my stomach. It was as if I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone there. But every time I turned around, the woods were empty. I tried to shake off the feeling and continued my walk, but it lingered. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the land. That night, things started to get strange. I sat on the porch, sipping a glass of wine, watching the moon rise over the lake. The quiet was oppressive, as though the world had gone still in anticipation. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard a sound. A low, almost indistinguishable whisper. It wasn't the wind or the rustling of the trees. This was something different. I stood up, straining to hear, but the sound was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the isolation was getting to me. Deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to shake off the unease. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The whispering lingered in the back of my mind, and every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I could hear it again, just beyond the walls of the cabin. The next morning, I woke up early, determined to push past whatever was bothering me. I made breakfast, had some coffee, and decided to spend the day at the lake. I needed to clear my head. The water was calm, and I spent hours sitting by the shore, watching the ripples break the surface. The whole day passed without incident, and I felt a little better. But as evening approached, the feeling of being watched returned. This time, it was stronger. I hurried back to the cabin, my pace quickening as the shadows grew longer. I was nearly at the door when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but when I looked again, it was still there. A figure standing in the middle of the path, just at the edge of the woods. I froze. The figure was tall, dressed in what looked like a dark coat, but its face was hidden in shadow. I couldn't make out any details, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. I should have turned around, gone back into the cabin, locked the door, and pretended like nothing had happened. But instead, I took a step forward. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was foolishness, but something compelled me to move. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't move at all. It was as if it were waiting for me. I took another step, and then, in a blink, the figure was gone, vanished into thin air, like smoke dissolving in the wind. My heart skipped a beat, and I ran into the cabin, slamming the door behind me. I locked it, my hands shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, that I had imagined the whole thing, but deep down, I knew what I had seen. That night, I locked myself in the bedroom and kept the lights on. The whispering returned, louder now, echoing through the walls of the cabin. I tried to block it out, but it was impossible. It sounded like voices, distant and muffled, but they were there. I heard them clearly now, but I couldn't make out the words. I was terrified. I tried to sleep, but it was useless. The fear had taken hold of me, and every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made my heart race. Then, just as I thought I might go mad from the noise, I heard something different. A knock. 3 sharp raps on the door. I froze. My mind screamed at me to ignore it, to pretend I didn't hear it. But I couldn't. The knock came again, and this time it was louder, more insistent. There was someone at the door. But who? There was no one else around. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I had seen no cars, no signs of life for days. I stood there paralyzed as the knocking continued. I couldn't make myself move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then the door creaked open. It was as if it opened by itself, without me touching it. The room grew colder, the air thick with a suffocating presence. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned toward the door, and there, standing in the doorway, was the figure from the woods. But now, it was different. Its face was visible, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck in the light around them. Its mouth twisted into a smile that was too wide, too unnatural. The figure stepped forward, and I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in place. The figure moved closer, its smile never fading, its eyes never blinking. It was as if it were enjoying my terror, feeding off it. The air in the cabin grew thick, oppressive, and I felt my chest tighten, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed. Duo. Alpoderan. I screamed as loud as I could, hoping someone, anyone, could hear me. But the figure didn't flinch. It didn't even react. It just stood there, smiling, waiting. And then I heard it. A voice came from deep inside my mind, as though the figure were speaking directly into my thoughts. "You are the last guest," it whispered. "The last one to leave." I closed my eyes, but the image of the figure didn't disappear. It was burnt into my mind, its empty eyes and twisted smile haunting me. And I knew, in that moment, that I would never leave the cabin, because the last guest was always the one who stayed. Story 23. It had been a long day at work, and by the time I got home, I was exhausted. The apartment felt unusually quiet, as though the world outside had faded away. I lived alone, and while it wasn't the most spacious place, it had always felt like mine. There were a few familiar creaks in the floorboards, the low hum of the refrigerator in the corner, but nothing that would make me feel uneasy. I threw my coat over the back of the couch, kicked off my shoes, and went to the window to check the weather. It was the kind of late autumn evening that made you want to stay inside, warm and cozy. The wind had picked up, howling against the window panes. As I looked out, I noticed something strange. In the apartment building across the street, the lights in one of the upper windows were on. I hadn't seen anyone living there before. I hadn't seen anyone living there before. The place had always been vacant, the blinds always drawn tight. But now, there was a faint glow coming from the window. I stared at it for a moment, curious. The building was old, a few decades at least, but I'd never seen anyone. I figured maybe someone had just moved in, though I couldn't remember hearing any new tenants. I shrugged it off, pulling the curtains closed. The idea of someone watching from the window didn't sit right with me, even though I knew it was just my imagination. I tried to push the thought from my mind, went to the kitchen, and made myself a cup of tea. The quiet was a comfort after a stressful day, and I started to relax. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping sound. At first I thought it was the wind knocking against the window, but when I looked over I realized that wasn't it. It was coming from the window across the room. I froze. The same window, the one that faced the building across the street. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I walked over to it, heart pounding, but when I looked outside, there was nothing, no one in sight, just the building across the street. I squinted, trying to make out any movement in the window, but there was nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was probably just a branch hitting the glass, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I walked back to the couch, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. The tapping continued. It wasn't a branch, I realized. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, and then it stopped. Complete silence. For a long moment, I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the window, my mind racing. Something wasn't right. I didn't know what it was, but I felt it, like a cold presence in the room. My hands were shaking. I forced myself to sit back down, but I couldn't focus on anything. My eyes kept drifting toward the window, and then, as if on cue, the tapping began again. Louder this time. 3 quick knocks. I stood up, my pulse racing. There was no way the sound could have come from outside. I turned and walked back to the window, but this time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to look. Still, my curiosity won out. I pulled the blinds aside. The street was dark. The building across from me still. The lights in that one upper window still glowing faintly. I could see no one, but then something caught my eye. At the window, a figure, standing perfectly still. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but no. There was definitely someone standing in that window. I gasped, stumbling back. The figure was tall, its features indistinguishable in the dark, but I could make out the outline of its shape, and then it moved, slowly, deliberately. It raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. A chill shot down my spine. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct told me to turn and run. My heart hammered in my chest as the figure stared back at me. It didn't move its head. It didn't blink. It just stood there, hand pressed against the window, staring at me. I felt like I was trapped, unable to move, unable to break the connection. I could feel its gaze burning through me, even though the distance between us was miles. Then, without warning, it slowly lowered its hand and stepped away from the window, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I bolted for the door, my feet barely touching the ground. My mind raced as I reached for my phone, dialing the number of the building manager. I needed to know who lived in that apartment. I needed answers. The phone rang once, twice, then 3 times before it picked up. "Hello?" the manager's voice said, groggy. "Hey, I live in the apartment across from the building you manage," I said, breathless. "Who's in apartment 6B? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. 6B? The manager asked. That apartment's been empty for years. No one's lived there for as long as I can remember. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, but I just saw someone in the window. You saw a reflection, the manager interrupted, his voice suddenly cold. That building is old. Sometimes the reflections from the street create illusions. There's no one in that apartment. My stomach twisted. Thus, Suyomri. I'm from child. There's no one. No, I'm telling you, I saw them. I'm sure of it. The manager sighed. You're probably just imagining things. I wouldn't worry about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I hung up the phone and sat there in the dark, my mind racing. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, a product of my overactive imagination. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt. And the worst part, the figure had been watching me for much longer than I realized. The next morning, I went back to the window. The lights were off in the apartment across the street. The window was empty, but something was wrong. There, pressed against the glass, was a single handprint. Story 24. I had always been fascinated by old antiques. There was something about the way they held onto the past, as though they carried the stories of those who had owned them before. So, when I stumbled upon the antique shop tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, I couldn't resist going inside. The shop was dimly lit, the shelves lined with all sorts of curiosities. Old books, dusty furniture, strange trinkets from another time. But what caught my attention was a large, ornate mirror. It stood tall in the farthest corner of the shop, its frame intricately carved with what appeared to be twisted vines and symbols that seemed to shift when you looked at them too long. The glass itself was cloudy, as though it had aged far beyond its years. The shopkeeper noticed my gaze and approached with a knowing smile. "Ah, that one," he said, his voice low and raspy. "That mirror has quite the history. But be warned, it's not for everyone." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The shopkeeper's expression darkened. "Some say it doesn't just reflect what's in front of it. Some say it shows other things. Things you don't want to see." I laughed, dismissing his words as nothing more than an attempt to build mystery. "How much for it?" The shopkeeper hesitated for a moment before giving me a price, far less than I would have expected for something so old and beautiful. He seemed almost eager to let it go. I agreed immediately, handed over the money, and left the shop with the mirror in tow. It wasn't long before I had it set up in my apartment. The moment I placed it against the wall, something felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The room suddenly seemed colder, the shadows darker. I shook it off as my imagination and went about my day. The next few days passed uneventfully, but each time I glanced at the mirror, I felt unsettled. The reflection in the glass seemed slightly distorted, not in a way that was obvious, but enough to make my skin crawl. The images that it showed didn't feel like my own. They seemed wrong. I would catch glimpses of faces that weren't mine, fleeting figures that moved just out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned to face them, nothing was there. It was late one evening when I truly began to understand what the shopkeeper meant. I'd been sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed a figure in the mirror's reflection. At first, I thought it was just my own movement, but when I looked closer, my breath caught in my throat. The figure standing in the reflection wasn't me. It was a woman, her features blurred and hazy, as though the reflection was trying to hide her face. She was standing still, her hands at her sides, but her eyes were locked on me. I froze, unable to look away. She didn't move, but her presence felt invasive. I quickly stood up, my heart racing. and turned around. The room was empty. The mirror reflected only the usual, my living room, the furniture, the light from the lamp. I exhaled slowly, trying to convince myself it had been nothing. The trick of the light, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The woman was still there, and the reflection, just out of my line of sight. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The image of that woman's eyes haunted me. I had to know what was going on with the mirror. I had to understand why it felt so wrong. The next morning, I decided to do some research. I found nothing about the mirror itself, but I stumbled upon stories about similar mirrors. Antique mirrors that didn't just reflect the physical world, but something else. Some said they were windows into another realm, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead were thin. I didn't believe in such things, of course. I was a skeptic, someone who prided myself on logic and reason. But as the days passed, the occurrences grew harder to ignore. It wasn't just the woman in the reflection. Sometimes, when I walked past the mirror, I would catch something else in the glass. Something that wasn't reflected in the room behind me. Shadows that moved on their own. A flicker of movement that didn't belong. I tried to distance myself from it, to pretend it wasn't happening, but it was impossible. The mirror's presence began to feel like a weight in the room, oppressive and suffocating. And then came the night I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had been cleaning up around the apartment when I saw her again. The woman in the reflection. This time, she wasn't standing still. She was moving. Slowly at first, her figure shifting in the glass, as though she was inching closer. I took a step back, my heart racing. But the woman didn't stop. Her eyes locked onto mine once more, and she smiled. A cold, empty smile that sent a shiver down my spine. She raised a hand, and I could see the outline of something in her palm. A key. It looked old, rusted, its metal worn and jagged. I felt the urge to reach out, to take it, but I resisted. I turned and ran, leaving the apartment behind. I couldn't stay there anymore. Not with the mirror, not with her in it. I returned to the antique shop, hoping the shopkeeper would take it back. When I entered, I found him sitting behind the counter, waiting. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice calm, almost as if he had expected it. "The mirror isn't for you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's showing me things. I don't know what it is, but I can't take it anymore." The shopkeeper nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's not the mirror that's the problem," he said quietly. "It's the reflection." It was only a matter of time before it reached out to you. I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" The shopkeeper didn't answer, instead walking over to the mirror, now sitting behind the counter. He looked at it for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "You should never have taken it. The mirror is a doorway, and once you've opened it, you can't close it." I felt my stomach drop. "What do I do?" The shopkeeper turned toward me. "Run out and do a shoe." Shopkeeper turned toward me. "There's only one way to get rid of it. You have to give it back, but you must leave something in its place." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. "A reflection," he said simply. "A new one. It needs something to replace what you've given it." I didn't ask any more questions. I couldn't. I had no choice but to return it. When I walked out of the shop, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something that had been watching me through the glass, and I knew, deep down, that the woman was still out there. Story 25. It was a rainy night when I moved into the old house at the end of the street. The one no one ever talked about. The one that had sat empty for years. Its windows dark, its lawn overgrown. It was the kind of place that people avoided, but I had never been one to shy away from a challenge. When I saw the for sale sign, I didn't hesitate. The price was too good to pass up. The house was large, too large for just one person. But I liked the idea of having space, of being alone in a place that felt abandoned. I spent the first few days getting acquainted with my new home. It was colder than I expected, with drafts seeping in through the old wooden floors. The walls creaked as if they were whispering secrets from the past. But there was one thing that stood out to me more than anything: the silence. It was absolute. There were no sounds of traffic from the street, no chirping of birds outside the window, not even the rustling of leaves. The house was eerily quiet, as though it existed in its own world, separate from everything else. It was unsettling, but at the same time, it felt peaceful, too peaceful. The first night, after unpacking, I decided to take a walk through the house. The living room was large, with a fireplace that had long since been unused. The kitchen was cold and empty, with faded wallpaper peeling from the walls. As I made my way upstairs, the quiet seemed to deepen, wrapping around me like a thick blanket. But then, just as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard something. It was faint at first, just a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the whisper of a breeze. But then it grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like breathing. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The breathing was slow and steady, almost rhythmic. But it didn't sound like any human breath I had ever heard. It was heavy, labored, as if something was struggling to take each breath. I looked down the hallway, but there was nothing, no movement, no source of the sound. I waited, listening, but the breathing stopped as suddenly as it had started. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. It was probably the house settling, I thought. Old houses made strange noises all the time, but that didn't explain how real it had sounded, or how it had seemed to come from nowhere. Over the next few days, the breathing came and went. Sometimes I would hear it late at night when I was lying in bed, unable to sleep. Other times, it would start up while I was downstairs, like a distant whisper coming from the upper floors. No matter where I went in the house, it was always there, following me. The sound of struggling breath, like someone or something was trapped in the walls. I started to grow paranoid, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. I checked the attic, the basement, every closet, every room, but I found nothing. There were no hidden passageways, no secret rooms, just the same empty spaces. But the breathing persisted. One night, I decided to confront it. I couldn't take it anymore. The isolation, the creeping fear that something was watching me. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness of the hallway. The house was silent, but I knew better than to trust the quiet. I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The air grew colder the further I went, and soon I found myself standing in front of a door I had never noticed before. It was an old wooden door, slightly ajar, as though it had been waiting for me to find it. My hand trembled as I pushed it open. Inside, the room was dark, but I could make out the shape of a large, old-fashioned mirror against the far wall. It was framed in tarnished gold, its surface cracked and dusty. It was the only thing in the room. I approached it cautiously, my breath shallow. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the room itself was holding its breath. I reached out to touch the mirror, and the instant my fingers brushed against the glass, the breathing started again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just coming from the walls or the ceiling. It was coming from the mirror. I recoiled, but the sound didn't stop. The breathing grew louder, more desperate. I could hear it rattling through my bones, as if it was inside of me. I looked into the mirror, and for the first time, I saw it. A face pressed against the glass, distorted and pale, its eyes wide with terror. Its mouth moved, but the words were drowned out by the sound of its breath. I could feel its presence behind the glass. Trapped, struggling to get out, I stumbled back, my heart racing, but the face remained. It was as though the mirror was alive, feeding off the silence of the house, trapping whatever was on the other side. The sound of the breathing grew louder, more frantic, as if the thing in the mirror was trying to break free. I ran from the room, slamming the door behind me, but the sound of its breath followed me. It was everywhere now, filling the house, drowning out all other noise. It was as though the mirror had unlocked something inside the walls. The house was no longer quiet. I couldn't escape the sound. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to go near the mirror again. The room felt wrong, and the silence was unbearable. I packed up what little I had left and left the house that very day. I couldn't stay there anymore, not with the thing in the mirror, not with the sound of its breath. I moved into a new place, a small apartment in the city. But every night, when I close my eyes, I can still hear it. The breathing, the desperate, struggling breath that won't stop. It's inside my head now, echoing in the silence, waiting. And every time I look into a mirror, I wonder, will it reach out and pull me into the glass, trapping me in its world of silence forever?